the lawyers, as with the shell companies, Teodorin got more than just the house. Thanks to American loopholes, he also got to enjoy the anonymity that came with it. As documents later revealed, Teodorin opted to pay for the house with an account attached to one of his anonymous shells, Sweetwater Malibu, LLC. Baden later said that Nagler specifically made sure Teodorin's name never appeared on the deed or title for the house. The selling agent set up an escrow account with First American Title Company, which would then transfer the funds to Wachovia Bank in order to pay the sellers. Escrow is an arrangement in which a third party temporarily houses significant sums of money or assets, typically between buyer and seller. But there again, another loophole. Thanks to the Treasury Department's temporary exemptions, escrow agents, overseeing the escrow accounts, were excepted from any anti-money laundering provisions. Banks still had to run basic anti-money laundering checks on the escrow agents themselves, but after that, with an escrow agent in charge of the account, the oversight ended. Escrow agents could effectively use the Treasury Department's temporary exemption as a magic wand, removing themselves from any obligation whatsoever. The banks, meanwhile, were legally allowed to look the other way and not peek under the hood of the money coming into the escrow account. As later Senate documents revealed, banks' anti-money laundering checks depended upon the escrow agents policing their own clients. But there wasn't a single law forcing those running the escrow accounts to do so. As Wachovia later told investigators, the money came in with no questions asked. It was American kleptocracy in real time. You had an anonymous shell company, a lawyer who didn't need to know anything about his client's finances, and industries and tools, in this case, real estate and escrow accounts, that could skirt basic anti-money laundering protocols. Anonymity, legal protections, industries that didn't need to do anything besides cash your checks. What more did a kleptocrat need? Nor was that all. As Baden later revealed, Teodorin forced the real estate agent and all those involved in the purchase to ink a separate confidentiality agreement. Baden was now legally barred from disclosing Teodorin's role in the purchase to anyone. But even then, the agent claimed that the confidentiality agreement was hardly a red flag. He'd signed others in the past, usually for a celebrity type of person. Teodorin, though, appeared to be the first rapacious kleptocrat he'd ever signed one for. In April 2006, the deal closed. Teodorin, who was the subject of high-profile congressional investigations into his corruption, had secured a beautiful house through his American conduits, and he managed to do so legally and anonymously throughout the entire process. Teodorin's marriage of American shell companies and American lawyers and American real estate was, in a sense, as clear a model of American kleptocracy as you could find. And it was a model replicated across the country, all for the benefit of regimes buoyed by corrupt cash. It was the same method that Iranian government officials used to anonymously purchase Manhattan skyscrapers in order to skirt sanctions. It was the same method kleptocratic Venezuelan oligarchs used to anonymously purchase South Florida luxury properties, and crooked Nigerian politicos used to inject dirty money into Houston's housing market. It was the same method the spawn of dictators in Uzbekistan and Gambia and the Republic of Congo used to launder their corrupt wealth up and down America's coastlines, and a method that included, as we'll see in the final section, Trump properties. It was the same method that saw billions and billions of dollars race into America's housing market over the past 2 decades, inflating prices for the rest of us, allowing these human rights abusers to freely enjoy the fruits of their brutality. At last, with his Malibu mansion in his pocket, the road to celebrity was wide open for Teodorin. He immediately began plotting out his next steps on his parade to stardom. And he promptly began staffing up, creating a hive of activity around the Malibu property, bringing in dozens of waiters and cleaners and employees who could fill out the place and who, on Teodorin's instructions, would form a standing line to applaud him every time he left the house and every time he returned. It was almost as if the Riggs hearing, which had revealed his family's gross corruption just 18 months prior, had never happened. But while Teodorin started leading the life of American royalty he'd long sought, a federal investigator, thousands of miles away in South Florida, was sitting at his breakfast table, flipping through a newspaper. There, on one of the lifestyle pages, something caught his eye. Something curious about an African prince snatching up as many Rolexes as he could find. It was a moment that sparked a pursuit that would, a decade later, result in the Malibu mansion changing hands once again and finally snuffing out Teodorin's American kleptocracy dreams for good. Chapter 8. Fish Physician. You've been hit by, you've been struck by, a smooth criminal. Michael Jackson. In 2003, the Bush administration offered full-throated support for the passage of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, a groundbreaking multilateral agreement providing guidance on everything needed to combat corruption and dirty money. Shortly thereafter, Bush issued Presidential Proclamation 7750, which allowed the U.S. to specifically bar foreign officials accused of profiting from corruption, plus their families, from visiting the U.S. ever again. High-level corruption by senior government officials, or kleptocracy, is a grave and corrosive abuse of power, Bush would later say. Elsewhere in Washington, bureaucratic decisions followed suit. In March 2003, Congress birthed the Department of Homeland Security, which would thereafter house the U.S.'s Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. ICE would later gain notoriety as the most prominent face of Donald Trump's domestic crackdowns. At the time, however, ICE fell into something of a crack within America's anti-kleptocracy regime. The FBI traditionally manned domestic anti-corruption outfits, while the CIA tracked and trailed foreign operations, the kinds increasingly looking to the U.S. for all of their laundering needs. But ICE straddled both worlds, monitoring foreign funds racing into the U.S. and tracing their routes through the states thereafter. Following the White House's example, ICE leadership in 2003 announced the formation of the Foreign Corruption Investigations Group, an organization specifically tasked with tackling the kleptocrats running their networks throughout the U.S. in order to identify, trace, freeze, and recover assets within the United States illicitly acquired through kleptocracy. As with plenty of other governmental initiatives, though, the difference between theory and practice couldn't have been wider. These kinds of kleptocratic networks suddenly bubbling up, an autocratic Cambodian prime minister dumping dirty money into New York real estate, a crooked Malaysian financier living the high life in Las Vegas, corrupt Central Asian figures traveling up and down the West Coast, involved legal questions that the new ICE anti-corruption agents had never fielded, and jurisdictions with which they had no experience. The group identified potential candidates for investigation in the first few years, but ran into bureaucratic roadblocks and the difficulties that come with trying to pry open things like anonymous shell companies. By 2006, without much to show for its efforts, the ICE anti-corruption group appeared at risk of wasting away. Then, in a personnel shuffle, new leadership stepped in. The group's new supervisor, Bobby Rutherford, came with a rocky Southern accent, an openness to new ideas, and the experience that comes with 16 years of monitoring how Latin American drug dealers saturated South Florida with illicit drugs, as well as how they moved their money. Rutherford was initially told that the ICE group would primarily focus on Latin America and the Caribbean, especially the cartels growing in prominence. But Rutherford had a different idea. I had done the taco circuit for so long with drug cases, the Caribbean, all that. I just didn't want to mess with it anymore, Rutherford told me. He was tired of chasing the same networks, the same bagmen, the same drug runners infesting Bogota and Caracas and Mexico City, island hopping through the Caribbean to reach their final destinations in the U.S. It was time to think a bit bigger. The ICE group's headquarters would remain in Miami, but with Rutherford as the new supervisor, they were going to expand their writ. They were going to think the same way their prey did, globally. The organization was in existence as a money laundering group to target Central American, South American officials that were stealing and bringing the stolen merchandise, money, into the U.S., Rutherford told me. When I took over the group, I said, "Why are we just doing South America? We should be doing the whole world. No one else is doing it." No one was doing it, and I told everyone that we were the group. We're starting to cover the whole world. With all eyes at the time focused on Iraq and transnational terrorism, there wasn't much pushback in Washington. Everyone at headquarters had just changed positions and didn't know any different, and so they went along with it too. Rutherford's staff wasn't big, just a few dozen agents at the maximum, tasked with hunting the whales of the offshore world. They initially began digging into some potential kleptocrats to corral, including crooked Taiwanese figures and a Nigerian state governor burying his dirty oil money deep in the heart of Texas. But those cases had languished, with the group either unable to find cooperative officials in the home countries or getting stuck in all of the anonymity that buried the trails. One morning, just before arriving at his Miami office, Rutherford opened the newspaper just to scan the headlines. There was a name he'd never seen before. There was an article about Theodorin Obiang purchasing a Rolex and some other luxury items, Rutherford remembered. It was like a society page type article on this big guy from Africa who came over here with his government position and bought this and this and this, and he's partying here. And that was pretty much it. And I go, oh, who is this guy? That guy, according to later documents, was someone suddenly inhabiting a life of luxury that few could have dreamed of, let alone enjoyed. Ensconced in his new Malibu palace, overlooking the most immaculate coastline California had to offer, Theodorin began plotting out his next steps. He already had the American lawyers in his pocket, helping oversee his financial networks, even with American banks on the lookout. He had his American shells, and he had a seemingly bottomless pot of dirty money to draw from, courtesy of his father's regime and his own behavior back home. His California mansion was already humming with staff. Alongside the gardeners and the assistants, Theodorin began flying in a number of former police officers from Equatorial Guinea to provide security, including a chase team that followed Theodorin when he ranged around Malibu on his day-long benders. Theodorin would reportedly sometimes sleep as late as 9 p.m., waking only to keep the party going. All of these staffers, of course, needed to be paid. Shouldn't be a problem, Berger said. Thanks to their shell company and law firm accounts, Theodorin could pass his ill-gotten gains through an unwitting American bank, masked by attorney-client and shell company accounts, funneling tens of thousands of dollars and more to his security details and top-flight chefs and drivers whisking him around town. Later bills even showed one shell company account that directed some $7,500 for something called a fish physician for help maintaining Theodorin's new koi pond. Not that the money wasn't earned. Theodorin's security team later complained that he would drive like a maniac, routinely blasting through red lights. One chauffeur complained that he had to clean out bottles of urine that were left in the car. Another assistant accused Theodorin of sauntering up in nothing but an open robe while at home, saying menacingly, "When someone comes through these gates, they're in Equatorial Guinea." The same assistant later revealed that he carried shrink-wrapped bills in a Nike shoebox for girlfriends and escorts alike to go purchase whatever dresses they'd like. One of the dozens, possibly hundreds of girlfriends Theodorin cycled through during his Malibu stint reportedly fell in love with the kleptocrat. She was smitten by him. Smitten, one investigator told me. He just showered her with gifts. $50,000 Rodeo Drive shopping sprees. She was literally in love with the guy. She told her mom, "Mom, I met the prince, and my life is going to forever be changed." One problem. Theodorin promptly forgot about her, including an agreement to meet on her birthday. When he finally figured out, "Oh shit, I forgot that she's sitting there," he sent over a couple of his goons, who took her out on a shopping spree on Rodeo Drive. And we asked her, "Well, did you go shopping?" And she said, "Of course I did." After negotiating a $4 million deal with an interior decorator, Berger bragged about dropping the designer's commission a few percentage points. "I feel good about saving you money," Berger wrote to Theodorin. "I enjoy working for you." On one occasion, one of Theodorin's assistants told Berger that the kleptocrat wanted to buy something called jumping stilts. The boss saw a guy running down the street in these contraptions and wanted them, the assistant wrote, to which Berger replied that the best method of payment would be via their Unlimited Horizon shell company. It's unclear if Theodorin ever ended up bouncing around his house in these jumping stilts. And there were the toys. In the span of just a few years, Theodorin fleshed out his Malibu pad with an incredible 32 luxury, high-end cars and motorcycles, enough to start his own dealership and leave plenty of inventory to open new locations. Theodorin raced up and down the coast, pocketing anything that caught his eye. All he had to do, according to later investigations, was write personal checks attached to his shell company accounts, with the checks listing things like Ferrari or pay off 2005 Lamborghini Roadster in their memo lines. The fleet was remarkable. There was a $2 million Maserati and a $1.3 million Bugatti. There were 7 Ferraris, 4 Rolls-Royces, and 4 Bentleys, in addition to a pair of Maybachs and a pair of Mercedes, and a Porsche and a Lamborghini and an Aston Martin. There were days he would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars at a single Beverly Hills Ferrari dealership, and then, a few weeks later, hundreds of thousands more at a separate Beverly Hills Lamborghini vendor. There were so many cars that Theodorin couldn't even keep all of them. He had to house a number of the purchases at the Los Angeles Peterson Automotive Museum. Still, Theodorin never missed a chance to show off his collection. As journalist Ken Silverstein wrote, one night, Theodorin parked his Bugatti Veyron near the entrance of L'Hermitage, a favorite hangout where he'd gone for drinks. When he saw gawkers stopping to admire it, he sent his driver back to Malibu by cab so he could drive back his second Bugatti to park next to it. As he would say to his staff, "I'm wearing blue shoes, so get me the blue rolls today." He was, according to one source, at one point considered one of the top luxury car customers not just in Malibu, but in the entire U.S. All of it funneled via his American shell company accounts. Yet again, the luxury auto dealers didn't have to concern themselves with the source of Theodorin's income. To them, he appeared no different than any of the other high-net-worth clients they worked with. They were happy to cash his checks and keep the cars flowing off their lots and directly into his stead. Theodorin also developed a taste for things that float. For Christmas 2006, he spent some $700,000 to rent out Paul Allen's 300-foot yacht named Tatouche to fete his most well-known girlfriend, Grammy-winning rapper Eve. Taken with the boat, Theodorin promptly announced that he was going to build one of the world's largest super yachts himself. He immediately commissioned Kusch Yachts, a German boat builder, to draw up plans for a 200-foot custom yacht, one that would have, a la Kolomoisky, a shark tank aboard, in addition to a movie theater, restaurant, and fingerprint-operated doors. Total price tag, $380 million. While the designs for Theodorin's new mega yacht, codenamed Project Zen, were finalized, he also sought out smaller options. He picked up multiple performance racing boats from a dealer in Fort Myers, Florida, going for about $1 million apiece, and coming without any requirements from the sellers to inquire about the source of the money. These so-called go-fast boats topped out at almost 200 miles per hour, and could go even faster when tricked out with helicopter engines, which he reportedly demanded. But it wasn't always smooth. In 2009, Theodorin tried to ship one of his go-fast boats to Maui, but the boat slipped off the trailer, requiring substantial repairs. The kleptocrat apparently didn't even realize that Maui marinas didn't sell the leaded fuel the boat required, so he was forced to ship the gas at hundreds of dollars per barrel. With the craft fixed and fueled, the local boat pilot took him and a few of his arm candy women out on the water. But immediately after dropping them off after the day trip, the pilot frantically called his assistant. The earlier repairs had faltered, and a hole in the boat's hull immediately started guzzling water. The boat, in short order, capsized. Fuming, Theodorin was forced to fly in a special team from Honolulu to salvage the thing, bringing with them a separate helicopter and a number of trucks to accomplish the feat. And then there was the jet, a Gulfstream GV, a G5 in modern parlance, which soars over 50,000 feet, ranges over 10,000 kilometers, and uses a pair of high-end Rolls-Royce engines to fly so fast it can nearly break the sound barrier. Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, has one, as does former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, as did Apple savant Steve Jobs. And in early 2006, Theodorin decided that he needed to join their club. With the help of his lawyers, Theodorin found a $38.5 million GV for sale, held by a wealthy family out of Indonesia. Registered in Oklahoma City, the jet was technically subject to U.S. jurisdiction and U.S. law. Thankfully for Theodorin, though, there were no anti-money laundering or anti-kleptocracy laws regarding the sales of multi-million-dollar planes, since sellers of private jets, like luxury yachts, like luxury cars, were exempted from the requirements American banks shouldered. It was high-flight kleptocracy, out of reach of authorities and regulators alike. There was a small hitch, though. With high-end purchases like this, both sellers and buyers often use the aforementioned escrow accounts to hold funds, especially after an agreement has been finalized but inspections are still ongoing. Theodoren's jet purchase was no different. Using accounts linked to yet another shell company to hide his identity, this one called Ebony Shine International, Theodoren bundled millions of dollars in payment into a Bank of America escrow account controlled by McAfee and Taft, an Oklahoma-based law firm that often doubled as an escrow agent for private plane purchases. But the law firm, which initially appeared gung-ho on the new deal, balked. To be sure, like the American real estate agents and American luxury vendors elsewhere, McAfee and Taft was exempt from those pesky Patriot Act restrictions that targeted American banks. But the firm had adopted a voluntary anti-money laundering program, going above and beyond the legal requirements to try to sniff out dirty money where it could. And after receiving an initial payment from the Ebony Shine Shell Company in March, a representative from McAfee and Taft did something few other law firms and few other Americans in Theodoren's orbit had done. They requested more information. As the firm wrote Theodoren's lawyer, "We need some more information regarding the Shell Company as well as the identity of the source of funds." The firm didn't hear anything back, and the money kept coming in million-dollar tranches. On April 4th, the escrow account received the first payment of $2.6 million from an Equatorial Guinea bank. 2 days later, another $2.6 million, also from Equatorial Guinea. 1 day after that, over $5 million in a single transfer, all while Theodoren's lawyers ignored McAfee's questions about who was behind Ebony Shine or about why the millions were coming in from a notoriously corrupt jurisdiction. And why would they answer? Few other American companies or figures had ever turned down Theodoren's money previously, especially when they didn't have to. Nonetheless, McAfee and Taft wouldn't bite. Spooked by Ebony Shine's silence and the fact that the millions were coming from Equatorial Guinea, the firm announced just a few days after receiving the final payment that it was canceling the transaction and returning the funds. One McAfee rep later said that he expected an angry phone call from Ebony Shine, but none ever came. It's unclear what ultimately caused the firm to pull out of the deal. Perhaps it didn't want the bad press of being associated with Equatorial Guinea. Perhaps it actually had firmer corporate morals than its competitors, willing to forego clearly dirty money if it could. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like a sign that the idea that those industries exempted from anti-money laundering laws could self-regulate, that they didn't need any additional regulation from the government, may have been right. That feeling didn't last long. A few days later, Theodoren's team located another escrow agent, Insured Aircraft Title Services, IATS, which announced that it would be happy to help the buyer join the likes of Cuban and Schmidt and Jobs in owning a Gulfstream. Just a week after McAfee and Taft proved that some firms could take a higher road, IATS illustrated that there was really no need to, as long as they were getting paid. A few weeks later, the sale was finalized without IATS ever learning who the buyer was or who the millions in question actually belonged to. IATS's in-house lawyer happily and correctly assured all parties that no laws had been broken. As investigators later wrote, U.S. escrow agents selling multi-million-dollar aircraft have no legal obligation to know their customers, evaluate the source of the funds used in aircraft purchases, or take special precautions when dealing with anonymous shell companies like Ebony Shine. It didn't take long for Theodoren to put his new investment to use. Flight records over the next few years showed Theodoren zooming around the world, from Bermuda to Dubai to Brazil to France. From March 2007 to November 2009, the plane arrived and departed from the U.S. an incredible 35 times. One of those stopovers saw him swing by Las Vegas yet again, where the bill for his $5,000 per night stay in the Four Seasons presidential suite referred to him directly as Prince Theodoren. Girlfriends and models and escorts, more women convinced they'd finally found their prince, usually rode along to destinations extraordinaire. Few women, though, could compare to Theodoren's favorite female flying guest, Janet Jackson. It's unclear how exactly Theodoren and Janet first met. By the late 2000s, though, the two were clear friends, with Janet a frequent visitor to Theodoren's Malibu palazzo. Other friends, according to one of the federal investigators I spoke with, were Tito and Jermaine, two lesser-known Jackson brothers. The Michael Jackson family, the investigator told me, were frequent flyers alongside Theodoren. But there's no record of Theodorin ever meeting his idol, the man he and so many of his generation worshipped. After Michael Jackson died unexpectedly in the summer of 2009, Theodorin's opportunity to befriend his hero disappeared. As journalist Ken Silverstein wrote, Theodorin reportedly drove a Rolls-Royce Phantom to Jackson's memorial, but he'd never have the chance to meet the man he'd idolized growing up. Yet that didn't mean he couldn't remember the King of Pop and continue his legacy in other ways. As such, Theodorin had an idea. He would buy up as much of Michael Jackson's estate as he could, as many baubles and trophies, as many gold-plated records and Neverland trinkets, as many moments of icon and legacy tied directly to the pop singer, no matter the cost. Thankfully, there was an easy way to do so, courtesy of the loopholes provided by the U.S. government. In the U.S., art and collectibles vendors, including big-name auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's, have never been subject to any kind of due diligence or anti-money laundering regulations. Despite the fact that the U.S. has the world's largest art market, clocking in at nearly $30 billion, some 44% of global sales, the entire industry has long escaped any kind of regulatory oversight. For the auction houses that sell this kind of material, as a 2020 Senate report later found, there is no mandate for detailed procedures to prevent money laundering and verify a customer's identity. To be sure, the art dealers and auction houses can adopt voluntary anti-money laundering policies, but there is no legal requirement for the auction houses to confirm the identity of the buyer or that the buyer is not laundering money through the purchase. Or more simply, anyone can buy anything for any amount with any money at any American auction house. Through a tangle of contacts in the music industry, the Los Angeles-based Julien's Auctions landed the rights to distribute the lion's share of Jackson's estate. Selling off Jackson's estate was a natural fit for the auction house, which had already helped drive demand for everything from Marilyn Monroe merch to Muhammad Ali swag to Barbra Streisand tchotchkes. Founded by the genial Darren Julien in 2001, the auction house had ridden the wave of the growing memorabilia industry, a wave that had already attracted the interest of malign figures elsewhere. I go back to the auction business in the late 1990s with classic cars, which were laundered for drug money. The car auction company I worked for in the late 1990s, we got raided because the co-signers were drug dealers, Julien told me. Even with that history, though, Julien didn't seem perturbed by kleptocrats eyeing his auction house as a potential means of transforming their dirty money into valuable memorabilia. Dirty money is worth just as much as the clean, and all that matters is that these auction houses attract clients. At the end of the day, it's really what someone does with the money. How they obtain it, that's not our business, the affable Julien told me. It didn't take long for Theodorin to make his presence felt at the auctions offering Jackson memorabilia. These auctions, which began in mid-2010, fit the traditional mold of auctions elsewhere. Rows of potential bidders sit in front of a dais. An auctioneer, standing in front, introduces the item in question, offering a few descriptive tidbits about the item and its provenance, and then opens the bidding. The buyers compete to match the bid, setting off a race to the finish, with the auctioneer spitting out higher and higher numbers until only one buyer is left standing. For the Julien auctions, Theodorin assigned one of his assistants, a young, slender Los Angeles resident named Wanda Kelly, to outcompete anyone interested in Jackson merchandise. According to investigators and later receipts alike, Kelly was only too happy to oblige. In a number of separate auctions throughout the year, some in Beverly Hills, some in Las Vegas, even one held in Macau, where Theodorin's team phoned in their bids, Theodorin funneled millions of dollars to secure as much Jackson memorabilia as he could. There was a signed basketball from Jackson and basketball superstar Michael Jordan, each an MJ, which Theodorin grabbed for $245,000. There was the Silver Sheen MTV Video Music Awards Moon Man Trophy, snapped up for $60,000. There was Jackson's gold record for Beat It, one of Jackson's autographed jackets from the seminal Thriller music video, a life mask of Jackson's face when he was still alive, all bought for hundreds of thousands of dollars. There were even life-size statues of Jackson that the pop star had sprinkled across his Neverland ranch, life-size imprints of himself, which Theodorin shelled out thousands more for. If he couldn't hang out with the pop star himself, why not a half-dozen life-size replicas? One video survives of these auctions, which took place in Las Vegas in the summer of 2010. A middle-aged woman, the auctioneer, stands at the dais in a powder blue blazer in front of a black banner emblazoned with Julian's Auctions, flanked by photos of celebrities like Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. She looks down over the dozens of buzzing attendees, all of them carrying paddles to raise to place their bids. "Listen to me, I'm going to do something," she starts. "I'm going to open this bid at $1, so everyone who has a paddle will be able to bid on it at least once." Her voice starts to get louder, the crowd's noise rising in turn. "And then you can tell your children," she proclaims, "that you came to this auction," she starts to point at the crowd, practically yelling at this point, "and you bid on that glove." A flash on the television screen to her right reveals what she's talking about. It's an item anyone familiar with Michael Jackson lore will recognize. A white cotton glove, with a snap closure at its wrist, swathed in hundreds of hand-sewn Swarovski-Le crystals. It's Jackson's fabled bad glove, the pinnacle of Jackson's cultural imprint, the most garish, most inescapable legacy of Jackson's celebrity. The auction starts. $1, and all the paddles immediately jump. The numbers immediately spiral upward, the auctioneer peppering the crowd with figures, the paddles pumping up and down. The amounts quickly reach 6 figures. Electricity is running through the crowd, shrieks and screams and murmurs and gasps suddenly bouncing around. The auctioneer reaches $140,000 and pauses. "That's all you got?" Another paddle goes up, $150,000. And another, $160,000. The auctioneer pauses, looks across a waiting audience. "At $160,000, fair warning," she says. She looks around once more and raises her hand. Going once, going twice, at $160,000. Sold. The crowd immediately bursts into applause. The auctioneer smiles down at the winner. "I think they want you to stand. Take a bow," she says. There, in the front row, the young woman in the gray dress slowly stands, turns around, and curtsies for the crowd. Few in the crowd, if anyone, would recognize her. But as investigators later identified, the woman was Wanda Kelly, Theodorin's assistant, who'd just won the prize piece. As she said after the auction, "Let's just say I wasn't walking out of here without that glove." Payment for the glove, and the rest of the memorabilia, was straightforward. Since the auction house didn't have to concern itself with the source of a buyer's income, the auction house could simply accept a wire transfer directly from Theodorin's accounts in Equatorial Guinea. But that didn't mean that Theodorin necessarily wanted it getting around that he was the one behind Kelly's bids. After one auction, in which he shelled out $80,000 from Michael Jackson's crystal socks and another $140,000 for a jacket and shirt, an entire outfit nearly, one of Theodorin's assistants wrote the auction house, "Please make sure that Theodorin's name does not appear anywhere. Please make sure that where a name needs to be, my name is there. This is very important." He should be, the assistant added, invisible. The auction house was only too happy to comply. "I assume I need to rewrite the invoices in the same fashion as I've done in prior sales, putting all lots on one page, adding catalog page numbers, and changing Theodorin's name," one employee wrote after another raft of Jackson sales. In the span of just a few months, the bulk of Jackson's mementos transferred directly from the pop star's estate, via the auction house, into Theodorin's possession for what amounted to, a year or so since the singer's death, the most spectacular Michael Jackson collection in the world. Our interaction with Theodorin was always pleasant, Julian would later tell me. He was definitely an enthusiastic Michael Jackson collector. He was always a decent guy. And all those allegations about how Theodorin made his money? It's hard to... He's a client. Hard to take that hat off and look objectively, Julian added, because he did help our business, and was a good client. Back in Miami, around the same time, Rutherford had hit a wall. Each agent he assigned to look into Theodorin's case ended up distracted, dejected, or both. Some ran into frustrations from trying to glean anything from their counterparts overseas. ICE didn't exactly have the institutional or bureaucratic heft that someone from the FBI could throw around. Others ran into confusion about the shell company networks Theodorin employed, tripped up by the anonymous structures. One by one, the agents fell off or were reassigned elsewhere. Shortly thereafter, though, Rutherford met an agent named Robert Manzanares. Brusque, with close-cropped hair and known for freely cussing, fuckhead, motherfucker, and variations therein are frequent conversation companions. Manzanares joined Rutherford's team in 2008 with prior money laundering and corruption experience, though that was only in the domestic context. But there was an open slot to look into Teodorin, and Rutherford thought Manzanares might just be the man he was looking for. They threw me into this fire, Manzanares told me. I couldn't even pronounce Teodorin Obiang or Equatorial Guinea, the pronunciation of kleptocracy. Manzanares knew about laundering, but things like kleptocracy, with oligarchs and regimes pillaging entire countries and stashing their looted assets in places like the U.S., was magnitudes larger than anything he'd seen before. I didn't know all these buzzwords, he added. This was brand new for me. I did corruption work in the past, but foreign corruption? No. This was a different animal. But at a certain level, dirty money is dirty money, and money laundering remains the same, no matter the source. And when Rutherford asked him to take over the Teodorin inquiry, Manzanares didn't hesitate. What am I going to say? No? Rutherford would later call Manzanares a gold mine. Manzanares immediately threw himself into the nascent investigation, digging through the previous reports and notes. He thought back to something one of his former supervisors had said. One of my mentors always taught me to look through the canceled checks, look through the canceled checks, look through the canceled checks, he recalled. And there, amidst the reams of documents the other agents had compiled, was just what Manzanares was looking for. Listed as payment for a boat trailer, the check was a stroke of good luck, not least because the check was made out to a trailer company not far from the ICE Foreign Corruption Office. It was finding the needle in the haystack, Manzanares later remembered. Manzanares immediately hopped in his car and drove directly to the boat trailer company. He found the manager, introduced himself, and asked if he may have remembered the buyer linked to the check in his hand. Oh yeah, the manager responded. That's the boat for the prince. The prince, Manzanares responded. Yeah, the guy from Africa, the prince, said the manager. He came here with all of his bodyguards. Could this be Teodorin? The manager unspooled a tale of this prince building boats in Florida and told Manzanares which boat company he should contact. The investigator promptly reached out to the company. He told them what he was looking for and that he was trying to trace any financial documentation about how Teodorin paid for the boat he'd apparently purchased from them. The company rep told him they knew exactly who he was talking about. And that's when they told me, well, Robert, it's not one boat, it's 3 boats, Manzanares said. The company said they'd be happy to help. When Manzanares arrived to pick up the documents, he struck up a conversation with one of the female employees sitting nearby. They talked about this prince and why anyone would need a boat that travels 200 miles per hour. In the middle of their back and forth, the employee said, "You know, he got the glove." Manzanares looked at her. He had no idea what she was talking about. He was there to talk about boats, not clothes. I'm like, "Lady, what are you talking about?" "The glove, the Michael Jackson glove." "The sequined glove?" No one, not Manzanares, not any of his colleagues, not anyone outside Teodorin's immediate network, knew about the glove. Except, apparently, for this woman at this South Florida boat company. Manzanares asked her how she could possibly know that Teodorin got the glove. Her response? His assistant told me. She was bragging about it. He already knew who Teodorin's assistant was, but he needed more information on this Michael Jackson glove. Sitting at his computer, he began searching, and soon came across the video of the auction, and of Kelly landing the bid to win the glove. There was the auctioneer. There were the bids racing upward. There was Kelly winning and getting up to curtsy. As soon as the clip ended, Manzanares picked up the phone and called the prosecutors ICE had been working with to try to get a case going against Teodorin. I said, "I'm going to be forwarding you this auction where Teodorin buys Michael Jackson's glove," Manzanares recalled. The other line was quiet for a moment. And they're like, "What?" Chapter 9. United States v. Thriller Jacket. Once the question was, to be or not to be. Now it's to have or not to have. Oystein Exelber. Immediately after Manzanares discovered that Teodorin was secretly behind the purchase of Michael Jackson's crystal-studded glove, he reached out to the man who had made the entire purchase possible, Julian, whose auction house had enabled Teodorin's memorabilia spree for years. When the investigator and Julian first spoke, the auctioneer blanched. Had he done something wrong? Had he committed any crimes? Was he under suspicion? The investigator soothed him, telling Julian that he was interested only in tracking Teodorin's assets. After all, auction houses like Julian's still remain exempt from basic anti-money laundering and anti-kleptocracy requirements. There was no reason for Julian to worry. He'd done nothing wrong, Manzanares told me. Absolutely nothing. They had nothing to report. They had no duty to report. Zero. Zero. Still, Manzanares told him, there would be a subpoena coming in order to track the details of how Teodorin was moving his money on the back end and how he'd managed to fund the purchase of the glove. Julian said he'd be happy to help, but he wanted Manzanares to know one thing about Teodorin. This is a good-paying client, Julian claimed, according to Manzanares. The investigator thought for a moment. This was a conversation about a glove, a single, 5-fingered Swarovski set. Just the one item. But Manzanares now had a new question. Are there other items he should be looking into? Are there other Michael Jackson trinkets and trophies he should be asking about? Then there was that pregnant pause, Manzanares remembered, recounting Julian's sudden, conspicuous silence. It was a silence he'd encountered in cases before, a silence that confirmed a new trail. And I knew right then and there I hit a gold mine. Before Julian could respond, Manzanares continued on, letting the auctioneer know that he would be expanding the scope of the subpoena to include other items Teodorin, or any in his network, had purchased. And boom, we hit the mother lode there. Manzanares recounted years later, laughing as he did. Suddenly, the glove was no longer the single thread for Manzanares and American officials to pull on. Julian complied with the subpoenas, and the documents began flooding in. Dates, names, records, transactions. All of it, including emails from Wanda Kelly, the woman wielding Teodorin's paddle, trying to cover Teodorin's tracks. In one of the emails, Wanda says, "Listen, guys, remember, Teodorin has to remain a ghost. He needs to be a ghost. No one can ever know it's him," Manzanares said. She wasn't smart enough to understand that a subpoena is going to get me that information. And there were the details of Teodorin's obsession, his fetish, Manzanares called it, with Michael Jackson. The statues and awards, the gold-plated records and gilded socks, the fedoras and photos and sheet music. All the details of Teodorin's new, sprawling collection were there, all bought with the dirty money he'd brought directly into the U.S. An entire world of Michael Jackson memorabilia beckoned. The biggest single collection in the entire world. When we got that info back, you can start seeing the momentum carrying on and pushing the case a little bit further, Manzanares said. And I knew then and there that if it went to trial, that just made the case so much sexier. The sex appeal was all over that case. Back in Washington, a new administration was taking note. A decade after Levin's hearings in the late 1990s began lifting the lid on the aquifer of dirty money seeping through the American banking system, policymakers in Washington continued to look for an opening for long overdue fixes. But where the Bush administration focused largely on the role these dirty money operators played in terrorist financing, a new crop of American politicians took a more holistic view. The Obama administration, after all, had ridden to power on the back of a bruised, bleeding financial system, which exposed all the rot underpinning America's supposed financial security. And stories of the illicit wealth tied to foreign oligarchs and megalomaniacal dictators, stories like those of the Obiangs and Riggs Bank, which in many ways set the precedent for the stories of negligence and deceit emanating from other too-big-to-fail American banks, continued circling Washington. For an administration wedded to patching up a broken financial system, targeting the funds of the powerful and the corrupt still zooming into the country seemed like a natural fit. It didn't take long for the Obama administration to redirect American anti-corruption efforts from combating the likes of the Taliban and its terrorist allies to something far bigger, kleptocracy. In the summer of 2010, during a visit to the African Union Summit in Uganda, Attorney General Eric Holder announced the formation of a new shop in Washington dedicated to just that topic. As my nation's Attorney General, I have made combating corruption, generally and in the United States, a top priority, Holder told the attendees. And today, I'm pleased to announce that the U.S. Department of Justice is launching a new Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative aimed at combating large-scale foreign official corruption and recovering public funds for their intended and proper use for the people of our nations. The Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative was just as it sounded, a new group dedicated to identifying, seizing, and recovering assets purchased with dirty money linked directly to brutal regimes. Holder announced that the U.S. would be forming a team of specialists, a roster of dedicated prosecutors, who would target the kleptocrats blasting through the holes in the U.S.'s anti-corruption framework. We're assembling a team of prosecutors who will focus exclusively on this work and build upon efforts already underway to deter corruption, hold offenders accountable, and protect public resources, Holder said. Roping in personnel from the DOJ's criminal division, including from the money laundering and asset recovery section, the initiative would ensure that corrupt leaders cannot seek safe haven in the United States for their stolen wealth, another DOJ figure said. The U.S. could, technically, just bar these corrupt officials from visiting the country, but that wouldn't change the actual ownership structure of those mega mansions or private jets or luxury goods. They would still be owned by those crooked officials elsewhere, and there was nothing preventing a future administration from rescinding the visa ban and allowing these corrupt oligarchs and officials from diving right back in. Instead, the new Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative would do exactly what its name indicated: recover those assets. This process, known as civil asset forfeiture, had a lengthy history in the domestic context of the U.S., allowing authorities to seize ownership of assets purchased with corrupt or embezzled funds. But with the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, there was a new step, returning the seized funds themselves to the populations pillaged and brutalized back home. If we uncover such wealth, the Justice Department will forfeit and return this stolen money to its rightful owners, the people and governments from whom it was taken, Assistant Attorney General Lanny Breuer said shortly after Holder's announcement. This freeze, seize, return plan, according to one of the DOJ prosecutors involved in the initiative's early days, solved one of the major issues that had bedeviled other anti-kleptocracy efforts. If the crooked officials in question got wind of an investigation targeting them and their assets, or if they suddenly found themselves under criminal investigation, they could, thanks to everything from their deep pockets to their diplomatic immunity available to officials both crooked and clean, simply board a flight out of the country and head back home, where they wouldn't need to worry about extradition or prosecution. One of the things that'll sometimes happen when you realize you're under federal investigation is that you just won't come to the U.S. anymore, the prosecutor said. But those assets they'd plowed their dirty money into often can't hop on a plane with them, leaving things like real estate and other assets open to seizure by American authorities. Furthermore, civil forfeiture cases have a far lower threshold for success than criminal prosecutions. You can't do a criminal trial in the U.S. in absentia, the DOJ prosecutor continued. And then there's the evidentiary burden. For criminal cases, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. But for civil cases, it's just a preponderance of evidence. And there's also the statute of limitations. For criminal cases, it has to be 5 years from the event, but civil forfeiture has a much more forgiving statute of limitations. A new DOJ task force, specifically targeting kleptocrats and charged with specifically using civil forfeiture against their U.S. assets. It was one of the most forward-thinking moves the U.S. had ever taken in its escalating fight to beat back the kleptocrats swarming the country. And there was one candidate above all others whom the new initiative wanted to target: Taya Doran. Soon after the initiative's launch, the DOJ's new team connected with Manzanares and Rutherford, who were still overseeing the ICE investigation into Taya Doran. The two agents would remain leads on the investigative side, but the DOJ prosecutors would begin patching together the actual asset seizure filings, all in order to convince a judge that the money Taya Doran plowed into his American assets was, indeed, the proceeds of one of the most corrupt regimes in the world. To that end, the two investigators began delving into the inner workings of the regime that spawned Taya Doran, which meant one thing: interviews, and lots of them. The Americans already knew they wouldn't get much from the Equatorial Guinea officials they contacted, all of whom either cowered or profited from the Obiang family's operations. Instead, they decided to seek out some of those who helped build out Equatorial Guinea's infrastructure, its pipelines, its roads, its palaces. They decided to search out the European firms that helped propel the Obiang regime, and that, as we saw earlier in this book, often lost everything, caught in the maw of the Obiang family's ever-widening greed. The two agents flew to London and Rome and Madrid, but the glamour of these visits quickly wore off. The first time you go, it's fantastic, but after going to London 7 times in a year, it gets old, Rutherford remembered. On every trip, there were sit-down meetings in hotel lobbies and restaurants and U.S. embassies with those who'd seen the interior workings of the Obiang family's monstrosities, and who'd escaped with little more than their lives. A lot of the interviews were with former contractors that thought that they would be able to do business in Equatorial Guinea, Manzanares said. Then, after several months of doing work, you would have either Teodorin or his father, normally it was Teodorin, who'd levy a tax on their work, on products coming in, on any type of machinery coming in. And then all of a sudden, the relationship that these contractors had with the president, which had been an open door, those doors were closed. Overnight, the interlocutors told the American investigators, those business arrangements collapsed. Whenever Teodorin or his father saw fit, the machinery, the entire business operations, and all the profits that came with them, of these foreign companies who'd run afoul of the regime, was simply seized. And all the contractors could do was leave as quickly as possible. They were being threatened to the extent that they ended up having to leave the country in the middle of the night and leave all their equipment, which was all misappropriated by the regime there, Manzanares continued. Unfortunately, we spoke to many people that way. They also heard stories of those who couldn't make it out in time, or who refused the regime's dictates, and who lost out on more than just construction equipment or drilling rigs. Obiang's thugs would strap them down on a gurney, or some type of flat piece of wood, Manzanares remembered learning. They'd strap their legs down, their arms down, and they took an iron pipe and would hit the bottom of their feet until it was just blood oozing out. When you saw people walking and limping, you knew then that that person had been tortured. But even after exile, not every contractor the agent spoke with had given up on the idea that maybe it was all just a big misunderstanding, that the Obiang family had simply misjudged the businessmen's intentions, that maybe, if they returned, all would be fine. There was an Italian national that was working in Equatorial Guinea in the construction sector, and obviously they welcomed him in with open arms, with all of his equipment. And then months later, they kicked him out of the country, Manzanares recounted. Yet the Italian contractor, the one just booted from the country wholesale, couldn't move on. We met with him in Italy, and I remember telling him, "Sir," through a translator, "Sir, let it go. Do not go back there. You do not know what they're capable of doing, and they're capable of doing some vicious things." Not long after, Manzanares received a phone call. The Italian he'd spoken with, the one who just wanted the money he was owed for all the equipment appropriated, had ignored the Americans' advice and returned to the country. He went back to Equatorial Guinea, Manzanares remembered hearing. He got into his car, turned the car on, and the car exploded. It didn't take much to guess who was responsible. There were people that subsequently told us, especially the DOJ prosecutors and me, that we should never step foot in that country because they would poison us, the investigator continued. They were a savage, savage family. During the investigation, the two agents picked up hints of where Teodorin stashed his other assets across the U.S. After all, despite the anonymity when it came to how his money cycled through the U.S., Teodorin couldn't help but place himself in the limelight whenever possible. Just ask the boat vendors who heard the gossip of Teodorin's Michael Jackson stash, or the California luxury car dealers only too happy to service Teodorin's ever-swelling armada of automobiles, or the locals who didn't take long to realize who the new owner of the palace overlooking the Pacific, who this new fresh prince of Malibu was. "I come from the drug world, where you try to keep what you're doing secret, undercover," Rutherford said. "You can start immediately dealing in the drug world with destruction of evidence, covering your tracks. With Teodorin, it didn't make a bit of difference. He didn't try to cover his tracks. He didn't start destroying evidence. He kept going. That's just who he is, to our benefit." Nor were Manzanares and Rutherford working alone. The DOJ prosecutors continued to help, building the case one piece of evidence at a time. And simultaneously, an old nemesis of Teodorin's revisited the scene. Senator Levin, with his talented staff in tow. Levin and his colleagues at the PSI had spent the post-Riggs years turning over rocks in the broader world of corruption, on embezzlement in the United Nations, on tax haven abuses, on fraud around the world. But by early 2010, Levin and his staff wanted to revisit the topic they'd focused on in those post-9/11, post-Patriot Act days. They wanted to see what loopholes remained and what new loopholes had emerged to upend the U.S.'s anti-money laundering efforts. and whom better to revisit than the Obiangs? In February 2010, the PSI dropped its hammer. In a 328-page report titled Keeping Foreign Corruption Out of the United States, Levin and his colleagues detailed how corrupt foreign figures lean on American lawyers, American real estate agents, American escrow agents, and American shell companies to steer their dirty money on a path to cleanliness. Surveying the landscape of corrupt regimes laundering funds in the U.S., Levin's staff uncovered how the ruling regime in the African country of Gabon used an American lobbyist named Jeffrey Burrell to purchase armored cars without breaking any laws. They found that a corrupt Nigerian politician named Atiku Abubakar leaned on his wife, a U.S. citizen named Jennifer Douglas, to secretly funnel some $40 million into the U.S. They also discovered how a number of crooked figures out of Angola had utilized American shell companies to hide millions linked to an arms dealer named Pierre Falcone. And in the most detailed section of the new report, they found that an old friend was up to his same tricks. Over nearly 90 pages of details, minutia, and an incredible 538 footnotes, the report illustrated exactly how Theodorin had relied on real estate agents like Neil Baden and lawyers like Michael Berger and escrow agents like IATS to move, hide, and spend his dirty money, and how they could claim to do so perfectly legally. There were the details of Theodorin's mansion purchase and how he had compiled his armada of luxury automobiles. There were the details of sycophantic lawyers who had helped Theodorin move and hide his money. There were the shell companies, still whirring along in order to help hide the true ownership of all Theodorin's assets. There it all was. How Theodorin, even after Riggs Bank was wiped from the face of the financial map, had kept his money laundering operations going. Even with such detail, though, there were still questions about Theodorin's operations in the U.S. Theodorin and his American helpers did some very weird things, one of Levin's staffers told me. We looked at where Theodorin's jet had landed, and we found that he went to this weirdo airport just across the Mexican border. We talked to the people at the airport, and they said that Theodorin lands his plane here, and has armored cars come to the airport, and offloads all these boxes to the armored cars. Levin's staff could never quite square what Theodorin was doing in this dusty Mexican airport, or what was in the boxes. But the report clearly revealed that the private plane Theodorin and his cronies had gone to such lengths to purchase was for more than just his faux mogul lifestyle. These planes are not just playboy things. They are cargo planes that engage in who knows what, Levin's investigator continued. It could have been drug running, it could have been stacks of cash, or something else that they were taking over the Mexican border. Their planes are much more than simply playboy stuff. Because of a range of factors, not least the economic struggles that were still dominating headlines, the 2010 report didn't cause the same splash as the PSI's previous dive into the Obiangs. But it laid out Theodorin's post-Riggs operations, and all the Americans who greased the wheels of his activities, and the loopholes his American enablers abused to help their corrupt client continue to launder all of his ill-gotten gains across the United States. While Levin and his staff were dropping their latest report on Theodorin, Manzanares, Rutherford, and their DOJ allies had already come to the same conclusions about the African prince. In their conversations, in their subpoenas, in the dozens of flights and thousands of documents obtained, they began forming a case, one that would allow an American judge to greenlight a seizure of all Theodorin's American assets. Thanks to the civil forfeiture proceedings mentioned earlier, all they would have to do is prove the material was purchased with dirty money, which would then allow them to seize the assets outright from Theodorin and eventually funnel the proceeds back to the Equatoguinean populations suffering under the Obiang's dictatorship. Their initial play to freeze and seize Theodorin's American holdings relied primarily on his Michael Jackson memorabilia. While the judge was sympathetic to the case, she felt, as Manzanares recounted, that there wasn't a lot of meat on the bone, that a case built solely around targeting Michael Jackson memorabilia was hardly enough for the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative to tackle as a first case. As the judge told them, they might as well go for broke. So the team dug more, putting out public press releases regarding their search for Theodorin's loot, and they uncovered an entirely new slate of assets tied to the man whose dreams of celebrity were slowly falling apart. There was the private jet and the escrow agent workarounds. There was the flotilla of Ferraris and Bugattis and Maseratis. There were, as they learned in conversations with foreign counterparts, Homes tied to Theodorin in places like Brazil and South Africa and France, themselves also purchased with the proceeds of foreign corruption. The U.S. had no jurisdiction to issue seizure warrants for those properties, but there was, as Levin and his staff had likewise discovered, that estate in Malibu, those acres upon acres of sprawling space and infinity pools and a mansion that was larger than all of the American investigators' houses combined. That American palace, investigators realized, was something they could try to seize, if the judge signed off. At some point, no one's quite sure when, Theodorin realized what was happening. He'd escaped the Riggs implosion, shifting his financial flows through the tides of American anti-money laundering loopholes, and for a while, in the eyes of the law, those assets appeared on paper as perfectly legitimate. But his luck had finally run out. Through the work of Levin and his staff, who had focused extensively on Theodorin's crooked family, and through the chance of Rutherford stumbling across the newspaper story, his American assets were suddenly a millstone around his neck. His dirty money had transformed into something tangible, into cars and a private jet, into a mansion and more Michael Jackson swag than anyone else in the world owned. And those assets could, as the DOJ laid out in its announcement of the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, be seized and be taken from the man who'd taken everything he'd wanted prior. It was something of a catch-22 for Theodorin. If he'd kept his money circulating in the banks, it likely never would have been seized and could have flowed anywhere he wanted. There's a reason those banking funds are called liquid assets, after all. But as soon as it became something tangible, something outside of the bank, there for all to see, it was suddenly there for the taking. Or, put another way, the dirty money in the banks could be shifted at a moment's notice, but the supposedly clean assets in the real world were the ones at risk. It was a tension that the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative focused on, and that eventually deprived Theodorin of his favorite American assets. By the time Theodorin realized that there would be, maybe for the first time in his life, consequences for his actions, it was too late. Manzanares and Rutherford organized all of their findings, and the DOJ prosecutors, those tasked by the Obama administration as the spearheads of a new anti-kleptocracy effort, then bundled those details into a formal case against him. In October 2011, the DOJ filed 2 forfeiture actions, one in California and one in Washington, D.C., targeting the jet, mansion, cars, and Michael Jackson memorabilia. But Theodorin didn't back down. After the DOJ made its first moves, his lawyer pledged that his client would not remove any of his assets from the United States, so long as the original forfeiture complaint remained under seal. But promises meant nothing to Theodorin. They could be, as the contractors he'd targeted back in Equatorial Guinea knew only too well, easily broken. Shortly after the pledge, and unbeknownst to investigators at the time, an employee of his named Emmanuel Asamoah traveled to Malibu. He had one job: to smuggle as much of the Michael Jackson memorabilia out of the country as he could. 2 days later, he flew to Equatorial Guinea by way of France, taking with him, among other things, the most famous glove in the world. After returning to Equatorial Guinea, Theodorin stuffed the cultural center in the country's capital with some of his Michael Jackson merchandise. It's unclear where the rest of the smuggled Michael Jackson mementos currently are, or if they keep him company in one of his other mansions somewhere else. That wasn't all. While Theodorin's lawyer convinced American authorities that all the assets would remain in the U.S., his entourage managed to ship most of the cars to France, sending his luxury automobiles halfway around the world just to escape U.S. law. The kleptocrat also flew his Gulfstream out of American airspace, free to enjoy it anywhere the U.S. couldn't seize it. But there were some items he couldn't flee with. There was a $500,000 Ferrari, which, for reasons unexplained, Theodorin left parked in his Malibu garage. There was the series of life-size Michael Jackson statues that his employee couldn't carry with him, scattered around his Malibu grounds like confused onlookers. And there was the mansion itself, Theodorin's pride, Theodorin's palace, Theodorin's claim to American celebrity and American royalty. A mega-mansion that would remain tucked along the Pacific coastline, a testament to his greed and all the loopholes and enablers that had led him there. The house was just gaudy, Rutherford remembered of entering the place for the first time. It was just gaudy. It was a huge house. The rooms were huge. You had to have huge furniture, but it was not anything you or I would have picked. While Teodorin and his lawyers managed to stretch out negotiations with the American investigators, they could hardly play down Teodorin's clear corruption. When the DOJ announced the settlement of the case, which began as United States of America v. One Michael Jackson signed Thriller jacket and other Michael Jackson memorabilia, and ran on from there, their press release was stark. Through relentless embezzlement and extortion, Teodorin shamelessly looted his government and shook down businesses in his country to support his lavish lifestyle, while many of his fellow citizens lived in extreme poverty, said Assistant Attorney General Leslie Caldwell. After raking in millions in bribes and kickbacks, he embarked on a corruption-fueled spending spree in the United States. This settlement forces him to relinquish assets worth an estimated $30 million and prevents him from hiding other stolen money in the United States, fulfilling the goals of our Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, to deny safe haven to the proceeds of large-scale foreign official corruption and recover those funds for the people harmed by the abuse of office. And all that seized wealth would be sent to the original source, the people of Equatorial Guinea, whom Teodorin and his family had spent decades looting. Given that the Obiangs still run the country as their personal fiefdom, it remains unclear how exactly the money is supposed to be returned. This was the first case filed after the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative was announced, so a lot of people saw it as a test case, one of the DOJ prosecutors involved told me. And one of the things that the case did is show that these cases are doable. As the seizure documents laid out, Teodorin had acted like a virus, constantly on the move, infecting the openings and industries American kleptocracy had provided. He and his enablers had taken full advantage of the years of deregulatory developments across the American economy, those pro-business moves and loopholes carved out, attracting as much capital and revenue as possible, regardless of the source. Teodorin was, in many ways, the logical endpoint of those deregulatory decisions, of allowing quick, anonymous access to American companies, of allowing U.S. lawyers to work with whomever they wanted and helping clients hide their money along the way, of allowing access to American real estate and American luxury goods and American art dealers and auction houses to the world of clean and dirty money alike. The U.S. had thrown its arms open to anyone who wanted a piece of the American economy, provided they could pay. Of course, a kleptocrat like Teodorin would show up on America's doorstep. And even though he was eventually found out, the results of Teodorin's prosecution and settlement revealed the limits of asset recovery. For the average Equatorian, used to seeing Teodorin flaunt his ill-gotten assets and act with absolute impunity, the case in the U.S. represented an opportunity for some sort of real, tangible justice. So many of us still feel that the proceedings and the ensuing results thus far have been incomplete, said Tutu Alicante, the Equatorian activist who dedicated so many of his years toward upending Teodorin and his father's regime. But at the same time, it gives us hope that Teodorin's and other kleptocrats' assets, thanks to the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, are not going to be welcome in the U.S. So we're learning to celebrate the small victories and continue fighting for greater accountability mechanisms against kleptocrats. Manzanares, meanwhile, knew there were threads left dangling. Would I have liked to seize the aircraft? Yes, he said. Would I have loved to seize all the Michael Jackson memorabilia? Yes. Would I have liked to have arrested everyone associated with taking the Michael Jackson memorabilia out of the country? Yes. And those Americans who'd gleefully helped Teodorin cycle his dirty money through the American laundromat, profiting along the way, who never had to face any jail time as a result? Would I have loved to have gone and put handcuffs on Michael Berger? He asked. Oh yeah. Still, taking stock of the world of anti-kleptocracy efforts in the early 2010s, the victories far outweighed any losses or missed opportunities. Teodorin had finally been stopped. We did something that, quite frankly, nobody ever thought could ever be done, Manzanares said. And other countries took note. Shortly after the Americans came down on Teodorin, law enforcement colleagues from Brazil to France followed suit, unearthing details of his purchases in their own countries and seizing and freezing them along the way. In many ways, the disintegration of Teodorin's American empire was a high watermark for anti-money laundering efforts in the U.S. and for efforts to root out the corrupt networks worming their way through the country. It was a test case, sure, but one that succeeded more than any had initially thought. It showed how joint squads from Washington, comprising both prosecutors and investigators under the nascent Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, could work to target the licit networks, propping up illicit funds, and make an example of the most corrupt actors relying on the U.S. for their money laundering needs. And more broadly, it revealed that a new administration in the White House was more than willing to actually put its forces behind the anti-kleptocracy rhetoric just beginning to pick up steam, both in the U.S. and elsewhere. American leadership, resources, and ingenuity. All of it had been marshaled to stop, as Manzanares dubbed him, the poster child of kleptocracy, and to make sure all those following in Teodorin's footsteps thought twice. Part 3. American Warlords. We were not going to accomplish anything by getting money to the Russians that was going to get lost in some Swiss bank account or funneled into some oligarch's business. Larry Summers, on why the U.S. didn't issue a Marshall Plan for Russia in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's implosion. Chapter 10. Not a Gambino. Real estate was so perfect, it might have been built to launder. Tom Burgess. In the late 2000s, in the years before social media exploded around the world, a user on a website called YouTube uploaded a video that introduced the world to a city few had actually visited, Cleveland, located along the northern rim of Ohio. This hastily made Cleveland tourism video stood as one of the first of what would be known as viral videos, racking up millions of views and introducing untold users to the phenomenon. And it's not hard to see why. The video, crafted by a local comedian who claimed he'd received $14 million from the Cleveland Tourism Board for his efforts, features 50 seconds of shaky, handheld camera footage. The video's color palette ranges from a musty gray to a dirty brown, with all the footage captured under overcast skies. Fun times in Cleveland today, the narrator sings, flipping between shots of empty public squares, decaying stadiums, and startled pigeons. One shot in the video centers on an open bridge with a half-dozen unused silos behind. Here's the place where there used to be industry, the narrator warbles. Another clip follows a train past an empty concrete plain. This train is carrying jobs out of Cleveland. Another traces a pair of scruffy men wandering aimlessly. Cleveland leads the nation in drifters. As the video racked up millions of views, a sequel popped up, claiming to be another Cleveland tourism video. This second video featured shots of seagulls and payphones, broken windows and sagging signs, dead fish and slate-gray clouds. Clips of stalled building projects, under construction since 1868, near the gooped-up Cuyahoga River, CR River that catches on fire, and more aimless bodies and empty storefronts and treeless concrete. Our main export is crippling depression. A place where you could, as the narrator shares excitedly, buy a house for the price of a VCR. This, then, was Cleveland in the late 2000s. While American cities elsewhere transformed themselves into new magnets for new migrants, Cleveland watched its residents uproot for other, more promising places. Once a boomtown of American industry, the city's population decline began a few decades prior, when the country's industrial heartland began emptying out in earnest. But the death spiral didn't begin until the 2000s. Capped by a Great Recession, Cleveland, its dying downtown, its abandoned industry, saw a population that by 2010 was less than half of the city's peak nearly a century earlier, and continuing to decline. And then, as we saw in Chapter 4, a man from Miami arrived, a man with a jet-black beard and money to burn. A man who couldn't have been more than 25 and didn't quite seem to know what he was doing, but who said something about family money, or was it connected to gas wells, and who said that he wanted to help get Cleveland back up on its feet. A man named Chaim Shoket, who said he saw something that few, if any, in Cleveland did. Promise. Or, to steal a term from a certain new president in the White House, hope. As one city councilman would later say of Shoket's arrival, it was like bringing water to a very thirsty person. When Shoket arrived in Cleveland in 2008, Optima, the American arm of Ihor Kolomoisky's sprawling international portfolio, fueled by the Ukrainian oligarch's swelling banking and ferroalloy holdings in Ukraine, was still a lean operation. Led by Mordecai Korf, Kolomoisky's American branch had picked up a number of metal mills across forgotten pockets of the Rust Belt, in Michigan and Ohio and West Virginia. As one press release read, they saw the potential of the region. But Korf, connected directly to the Ukrainian oligarch, dreamed bigger. If Kolomoisky really wanted to work his way into the American market, if he really wanted to exploit that rampant American anonymity we've already seen and conceal nine-figure purchases behind webs of Delaware shell companies and purchases that no city officials would question, Optima would have to adjust its strategies. American real estate still worked for massive money laundering operations, but Teodoran-style mansions, Playboy pads, and beachfront sprawls in places like Miami or Malibu would never work for someone like Kolomoisky, busy as he was looking for ways to hide his assets from nosy Ukrainian investigators and tax authorities. They'd catch too much attention. What about something else? What about, say, commercial real estate, nondescript office buildings and the like? And what if, instead of flashy cities like New York or Miami, these buildings were located in a city or an area that no one would associate with the global uber-rich? Enter Cleveland, Ohio. Shokit immediately jumped at the idea. He could visit Cleveland. He could make the contacts. He could scout the locations. He could make those purchases. He could bundle, conceal, and inject that tainted Ukrainian money directly into the heart of the city. Shokit, as we saw in Chapter 4, made an immediate impression. And not just because of the money he said he could move. The 22-year-old was skittish, fidgety, prone to colorful outbursts, a far cry from the dour, reserved world of real estate management. He's one of those people who just love to make a statement, said David Browning, managing director of one of Cleveland's main brokerage offices. Maybe it's an outrageous statement, and he throws it out in a conversation in order to get a reaction. That's part of his style. But still, Shokit said the right things. I asked him, why Cleveland? Why now? Said Deb Janik, who helmed the real estate section of the Greater Cleveland Partnership, a private sector development group. His perspective was that it's a market where acquisition was possible, but also it was really his description of the city. He loves the historic nature of the buildings, the density of the city. Where others saw decrepit office space and empty windows, where others saw trains that took jobs out of the city and crippling depression as the main export, Shokit claimed to see something different. He has an eye for taking things that people don't necessarily see as desirable and doing something with them, said Mark Vogel, a local investment banker. It was something more art than business. Vogel was so taken with Shokit's promise that he later attended the latter's wedding in Brooklyn. It's refreshing to have someone so active in Cleveland, Vogel continued. I can tell you that he's a person who cares about the city of Cleveland and wants it to do well. When he arrived in Cleveland, Shokit also put on a bit of an air, playing up his New York connections. I laughed when I saw Cleveland's downtown was 3 blocks, he told one reporter. Your entire downtown would be like Midtown in New York. According to those who dealt with Shokit, the stories about the sources of the money he suddenly flushed into Cleveland consistently rotated. To some people, he tied the money to his parents. To others, he claimed some vague connection to post-Soviet gas extraction. A family connection helped me to get initial consideration in the real estate industry, he said at one point. But I'm on my own here, and I alone, am accountable to our investors for my decisions and my work. On at least one occasion, he let slip that the funds linked back to Privatbank, a clear clue for anyone interested that the money was tied directly to a Ukrainian oligarch growing in notoriety. But no one, it seemed, paid much attention. No one wanted to look too far into Shokit's financing, descending on Cleveland like manna from heaven. He loves to get out into the market, walk through other buildings, meet people, said Brian Hertuck, another Cleveland broker. You wouldn't necessarily see Keim at a huge real estate event, but if you talk to him and you rattle off names of other owners in town, other developers, key attorneys, he's pretty much made the rounds. Still, it's worth noting that not everyone in Cleveland was immediately taken with Shokit's talk, with Shokit's claims of adoring the city, or with Shokit's supposed dreams of what Cleveland could be. Something about him remained off, something odd. It became pretty obvious that something was not completely right, one Cleveland broker familiar with Shokit and his network told me. I'm not a Gambino, but this wasn't Real Estate 101. Something doesn't add up here. Something in the numbers, and the plans, and the promise that Shokit claimed to see. As the broker said, to be frank, it looked like money laundering. But Shokit claimed he would help shower hundreds of millions of dollars on Cleveland and invest in a place few others thought worth their time. A place that no one would suspect could be a new center of transnational money laundering operations. And, for the city, That was enough. As the local journalist who asked to speak on background said, Shokit simply showed up in Cleveland and started buying when no one else was buying, beginning what would become, according to analysts and authorities alike, the greatest money laundering scheme the U.S. had ever seen. In order to begin plowing Kolomoisky's money into Cleveland, Shokit and the Optima team had to identify potential candidates for purchase. The first building that caught Shokit's eye was a chisel-shaped behemoth called One Cleveland Center, built in 1983. Standing smack in the middle of downtown, flanked by a Dunkin' Donuts and a takeout pub, the office space soars over 30 stories high and houses over 500,000 square feet. As one of the downtown's most architecturally distinct buildings, if you squint just right, the construct resembles a large, aluminum-sided razor. The building was the perfect way for Shokit to announce his arrival. At the time, the building still retained a high tenancy rate, according to one of the brokers who eventually worked with Shokit. The office space within One Cleveland Center was nearly 90% full when the Optima team swooped in. But given the broader economic trajectories and the steady outflow of tenants from other office buildings, the building's prospects weren't especially bright. Which is why Shokit's offer stunned locals. $86.3 million, nearly a third more than the building had sold for just a few years prior. All you had to do was wait a little to get a bargain, said one local familiar with the operations. But he didn't wait. The locals involved in the sale would have been fools to decline. All of a sudden, with this single purchase, Optima had arrived in Cleveland, and Shokit now had a reputation, one that would eventually see the Cleveland Plain dealer describe him as confident, as an aggressive, quick-thinking deal-maker who had built a downtown Cleveland empire. It's unclear how Korf reacted when he heard the news in Miami, that this scruffy, wayward 20-something his sister had married for some reason could, despite the doubts, actually pull this deal together, that it actually worked. If Shokit and Korf and Kolomoisky could snatch a building like One Cleveland Center, a staple of the Cleveland skyline, slicing the air off Lake Erie, why not see what else they could grab? 4 blocks east, another office building beckoned. Known as 55 Public Square, and squatting over downtown's eponymous plaza for a half-century, the building housed 420,000 square feet. At one point Cleveland's tallest building, 55 Public Square hosted a number of white shoe law firms, given the building's proximity to local courthouses, and it was now on the market. As the deal on One Cleveland Center closed, Shokit began conversations with the brokerage firm selling 55 Public Square. The building stood smaller than the One Cleveland Center colossus and was significantly older, which is why it was valued at only $26 or $27 million. But just to be safe, Shokit had a different number in mind. Would, say, $34 million be enough? And would it be okay if, instead of roping in a mortgage or setting up some kind of third-party financing arrangement, he paid cash? The building goes on the market to sell, and the next thing I know, Keim shows up, and he doesn't do any due diligence, one of the brokers, who asked to speak on background to discuss the deal, told me. The broker, working for a New York-based firm, called his Manhattan headquarters to run the offer past them. I call New York and they ask, "Can you do some background on this guy?" After all, who shows up and offers 8-figure payments in a spiraling recession in a decaying city for an office building, let alone millions more than the amount for which it's appraised? But Shokit appeared clean. I couldn't find anything, the broker continued, sheepish a dozen years after the deal closed. But he wanted to buy the building cash, $7 or $8 million over the appraisal. There was no reason for anyone to think twice. I say, sure, I'll walk to New York to make this deal happen, the broker laughed. Eyes opened after Shokit's first purchase. Heads now turned with news of the second one. The chattering classes in Cleveland suddenly had a single name on their lips, Shokit. But the 20-something wasn't done yet. He'd pocketed 2 of Cleveland's downtown staples, but more stood there, ready to be plucked, ready to be placed in his and Kolomoisky's portfolio. There was the Huntington building, which we met in the prologue, running some 1.3 million square feet, described by the Cleveland Plain dealer as one of downtown Cleveland's largest and most prominent office buildings. Shokit's price, $18.5 million. There was the Penton Media building, another 500,000 square foot heavyweight, kitty corner from One Cleveland Center. It's a way to cover the whole downtown market, one of Shokat's colleagues said, giving Optima another arrow in our quiver. Shokat's price? $46.5 million. And there was the Crown Plaza building, a 472-room hotel conference center, the second largest hotel in the entire city, with another 20,000 feet of meeting space, some of which had previously housed the moribund Lehman Brothers. I don't believe there will be another downtown hotel that will mirror our hotel in terms of its luxury, Shokat said at the time. His price? $9 million. That final investment, finalized in October 2011, was a bit different and is worth pausing on momentarily for a brief detour into another tendril of American kleptocracy. To finalize the deal, Shokat broached a joint venture loan with a local investment outfit called the Cleveland International Fund, overseen by an Iranian immigrant named Eddie Zai. It's unclear why he set up this joint venture, but Zai raised his end of the funds by shopping so-called golden visa schemes to foreign nationals from places like China and Brazil, a type of scheme that has, with few paying attention, transformed into one of the key overlooked elements of modern kleptocracy. These golden visas, marketed in the U.S. as the EB-5 visa program, allow deep-pocketed figures abroad to shell out a nominal fee, usually around $1 million, to the U.S. government, alongside a pledge to initiate a jobs creation program in the U.S., all in return for American residency and an eventual path to American citizenship. The program allows oligarchs and kleptocrats to effectively buy American citizenship, regardless of the source of their income. These American golden visas are little different than so-called golden passport programs in places like Cyprus and Malta, which have proven magnets for a world of dirty money, most especially out of corrupt hives like Beijing and Moscow. Yet the American version has received little attention and little criticism. This despite the fact that the program, which has been dominated by wealthy Chinese oligarchs, has been linked multiple times to schemes of large-scale money laundering and bank fraud. Almost nothing is known about the backgrounds of applicants for the EB-5 program, analyst Belinda Lee wrote. The only information made available to American immigration officials is provided by applicants themselves on their application forms. Embarrassingly, many of the forms remain handwritten, with no digital copies existing. Trying to find a criminal hand behind the EB-5 applications, or to sniff out the dirty money behind the applicants, is like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but without knowing which haystack to even look in. All of which is to say, while the reasons for Shokat's partnership with Zai remain unclear, getting to know a man like Zai, who could help foreign oligarchs scheme their way to American citizenship, would be a wise move for a kleptocrat looking to slide into the U.S. Through Shokat, Kolomoisky's total portfolio in Cleveland stretched over millions of square feet and into hundreds of millions of dollars, making the oligarch and his crew the largest commercial owners and landlords in this major American city. I've not seen anything like this before, one local agent involved in the sales said at the time. They really, really believe in Cleveland. Nor was Kolomoisky's network done. Shokat had, as he said, big picture plans for the city. Just a few years removed from life as a nobody, Shokat had transformed Optima into the largest holder of real estate in downtown Cleveland, as Shokat's Wikipedia page reads. As the Cleveland Plain Dealer wrote, Shokat was now the most important guy you've never heard of. At least, that's how it appeared on the outside. For those inside, there was a different story. A select few got to step behind the funhouse mirror to see what was actually happening. They were the first, call it, out-of-town money for Cleveland that came in, one American familiar with their operations said. But from the start of it, it was questionable. There was a lot of shady stuff. Much of that, of course, had to do with the fact that Shokat appeared to have no idea what he was doing. Not bothering to run any inspections, overpaying time and again for buildings that held little promise. But much of that had to do with the method of payment. According to both American officials and those familiar with their operations, one of Shokat's and Optima's preferred payment methods was straightforward. Cash, made out via personal check. No banks, no mortgage lenders, no third-party financiers. Just a checkbook and a PIN, and a final number that, in most cases, stood millions of dollars more than the building's estimated value. With a bank as a lender, You have multiple options down the line about payment structures, about refinancing, about handling a potential recession if your financial circumstances change. Then again, with a bank's involvement, the lenders are going to spend weeks, and potentially longer, negotiating the sale, poking through all the financing and figures. But when it came to Shokit and Optima, they just wanted the buildings. That was all that mattered, according to those who saw the operations from the inside. Still, if Shokit wanted to overpay for the buildings he didn't even bother to inspect, no one would force him to do otherwise. After all, his checks cleared. So Shokit began touring the entire region, pocketing entire cities and towns on behalf of a Ukrainian oligarch no one in America had ever heard of. It wasn't only Cleveland. Kolomoisky's Optima Group also picked up steel mills and related plants, lifebloods of entire towns and entire regions in places like Warren, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, Griffith, Indiana, Ashland and Calvert City, Kentucky, Cicero, Illinois, Gibraltar, Michigan, and Letart, West Virginia, with the combined sales price stretching into the hundreds of millions of dollars. They'd started dropping their money in new metro markets as well, picking up an office park in Dallas and an office tower in Louisville. The combined price tag for those two properties alone, $124 million. Everywhere they went, Shokit and Optima reportedly said the same things. They were bringing jobs and dreams, renovations and revitalization. The world may have forgotten the American Rust Belt, may have overlooked these towns and these mills and these beating iron valleys, but not Shokit, not Optima. It was the same spiel Shokit unfurled when he drove to a place called Harvard, Illinois, a speck of a town equidistant from Chicago and Milwaukee in the American Midwest. Like the other towns in the region, Harvard's best days were behind it. But in the late 1990s, thanks to a couple of well-placed connections, the chairman of the massive Motorola Telecom Company made a surprise announcement. The telecom giant would be placing a new manufacturing plant in Harvard. Construction soon began on what would become the largest building not just in Harvard, but the entire region, a 1.5 million square foot facility sprawling over 320 acres, part office and part plant, shaped like a giant wishbone. It's a huge, huge building, one local, Ed Solis, said. It looks like a small university. With a $100 million price tag, Motorola announced it would require a staggering 5,000 employees to operate, to help craft the next generation of Motorola phones and lead the global telecom market into the 21st century. Physically, it's overwhelming to the town, Charlie Eldridge, head of the local Harvard Economic Development Corporation, told me, adding that Motorola and local construction groups immediately began building a half-dozen new subdivisions to house all the projected workers. It might be tough to remember now, but at the time, no one surpassed Motorola in the world of mobile phones. The original mobile operator, Motorola set the precedent that behemoths like Apple and Samsung would eventually follow. And there was no reason to think Motorola couldn't retain that leading position at the turn of the 21st century, especially given that it was confident enough to make a $100 million investment in an American farming town few could find on a map. But then, as the construction finished in Harvard, Motorola looked up and realized all of its competitors had passed it by. Motorola thought it could remain analog in an increasingly digital world. Customers, though, thought otherwise. In a matter of just a few years, the bottom fell out of Motorola's business model. And suddenly, the building in Harvard had no purpose. It would never be the cell phone plant originally envisioned. Rather than a testament to Harvard's future, it was a testament to corporate blinders. And for years it sat, like a beached whale, waiting. Then Shokit showed up. Pulling the same move he'd perfected in Cleveland, Shokit offered $16.75 million for the empty building. A far cry from the Motorola investment, but given the lack of any other real offers, the price tag was more than locals could have hoped for. They happily accepted. Glimmers of potential sprang once more. Hope burns eternal, Roger Lehman, another member of the Harvard Economic Development Corporation, said at the time. That optimism immediately washed over Harvard, all centered on a building that had long been vacant, a lifeblood that had long sat empty. It's been sitting there for so long, Solis added, it's like the building is cursed. Chapter 11. The Wild West. The Greeks knew that democracy is not likely to fall to the charms of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, or oligarchy. It's much more likely to fall to a corrupted version of itself. Tony Judd. While Kolomoisky was building his empire in the U.S., Ukraine began falling to pieces. In the mid-2000s, a roster of pro-Western figures had come to power in Kiev, promising an end to the elite-level corruption that cannibalized the country's wealth, whisking it out of the country in the process. By the end of the decade, though, the reformers were exhausted, frustrated, fractured. As a result, in the 2010 presidential election, Ukrainians backed an opposition figure named Viktor Yanukovych, a man whom they'd ousted via revolution just a few years prior, but who now promised a different path forward. To those who knew him, Yanukovych was little more than a brute, an imbecile, an unreconstructed Soviet who viewed Russia's neighboring dictatorship with envy. But in those post-Great Recession days, Yanukovych had an ace up his sleeve, an American named Paul Manafort, a man with the gift of turning any would-be autocrat into someone who could actually win an election. Hired by Yanukovych and his team to improve the strongman's image, Manafort crafted a campaign to spin Yanukovych as warm and welcoming, as a font of competence in these incompetent times. Thanks in no small part to Manafort's efforts, Yanukovych won the 2010 presidential election. But it didn't take long for Yanukovych's facade to fall apart. In November 2013, after months of pressure from Moscow, Yanukovych, with his cronies busy looting state coffers, abruptly pulled Ukraine back from negotiations with the European Union. Perturbed by the decision, protesters waving the blue and yellow flags of Ukraine and the EU alike gathered in Kiev's downtown square, known as the Maidan. Slowly, the protesters gathered steam, even in the face of Yanukovych's thuggish security services. Tensions soon spiraled, and in February 2014, Yanukovych's forces opened fire, with snipers raining bullets over the unarmed protesters, resulting in dozens of deaths. Realizing the murders had only galvanized the protesters, the autocrat tucked tail and fled to Russia. In hindsight, it was likely the right move for Yanukovych. Shortly after his ouster, journalists flocked to his mega-mansion outside Kiev. In addition to finding everything from ostriches to a golden loaf of bread, as well as nude portraits of Yanukovych himself at the estate, journalists elsewhere discovered a range of documents pointing directly to Yanukovych's financial malfeasance. Documents about offshore payments, documents about secret ledgers, documents about certain Americans, like Manafort, with whom the public would soon become intimately familiar. But we'll come back to those documents later, because it's in those heady post-revolution days that we rejoin our story of Kolomoisky and American kleptocracy. As Ukraine teetered in the days following Yanukovych's ouster, the Kremlin began barreling into southern Ukraine, claiming Crimea as an area that had always been Russian, and repressing the indigenous Tatar populations who highlighted that falsehood. From there, Russia began flooding swaths of eastern Ukraine, beginning the process of wresting provinces known as Luhansk and Donetsk. Ukraine's army quickly disintegrated. Yanukovych, it turned out, had spent the past 3 years selling Kiev's military for parts, mothballing tanks, and stripping entire regiments. Crimea was already gone, and just a few weeks later it appeared that the entirety of eastern Ukraine would follow suit and soon rejoin a revanchist Russia. Which is the point where Kolomoisky re-enters the Ukrainian story, and where he becomes something more than simply a banking and metals oligarch with a strange fetish for sharks. Watching Russian proxies chewing through chunks of eastern Ukraine, Kolomoisky had an idea. What if he bankrolled forces of his own to face down the Russians? What if he funded, organized, and armed thousands of Ukrainian patriots, eager to beat back the rising Russian nationalism rumbling through Dnipro and its neighboring regions? The new government in Kiev immediately agreed. Appointing Kolomoisky as the interim governor of the entire Dnipro province, they offered him broad writ to organize his own militia. According to one of his aides, Kolomoisky immediately got to work, ponying up tens of millions of dollars to help arm some 15,000 Ukrainian militiamen, sicking his new brigades on the pro-Russian separatists. "We're doing all this in agreement with the central government," one of those aides said. "We coordinate and cooperate with Kiev, and they accept that we are influential as a consolidating factor in the East." Not that everything centered only on national interests, necessarily. As Boris Filadev, Kolomoisky's deputy, added, the idea was to save the country and save his assets at the same time. Nor did the oligarch ditch the Shark Tank. When meeting with new pro-Western officials from Kiev, he would routinely press a button on his desk to release crayfish meat to his pets, unnerving guests as the water behind him turned bloody. But he played the patriotism card as best he could. Calling Putin a schizophrenic of short stature, the Ukrainian oligarch pledged a $10,000 bounty for pro-Russian militants captured with guns. As one of the battalion commanders said, Russians should come to Dnipro because here we will kill them. The Russians, though, never made it that far, largely because they and the pro-Russian locals soon bogged down, stopped by a regrouping Ukrainian military and by the thousands of militia forces flocking to Kolomoisky's banner. He took charge and is still seen as this oligarch who was patriotic, who was pro-Ukrainian, who basically saved the Dnipro region from what was happening in Donetsk, one Ukrainian journalist told me. By the end of 2014, a stalemate emerged across a swath of eastern Ukraine, covering far less territory than Putin and his proxies initially wanted. It turned out that Kolomoisky, as the Wall Street Journal dubbed him, had been Ukraine's secret weapon all along. As the oligarch later said in the third person, a large number of people think Kolomoisky's great, and the only patriot in the country. By early 2015, the oligarch looked to consolidate his gains. He already controlled Ukraine's largest bank and sat at the center of Ukraine's tangled web of gas extraction enterprises. And now he stood as governor of one of the key regions in one of the key countries for Europe's and the West's broader future. But new Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, an oligarch himself, looked to clip Kolomoisky's wings. In March, new reforms out of Kiev undercut Kolomoisky's control of the country's largest oil and gas conglomerate, called Ukr whose chair had been a close Kolomoisky ally. In response, Kolomoisky threw a fit. In a video later posted to YouTube, dozens of men, clad in camouflage and balaclavas, lugging boxes and bags and weaponry, are seen hustling into the company's headquarters under cover of night. They block the entryways, affixing metal grills to the doors, turning back inquiring journalists. One man let slip the group's affiliation. They were Kolomoisky's militia, come to help their patron. Shortly thereafter, Kolomoisky himself appears. Walking to reporters waiting outside, wearing a striped blazer and black t-shirt, the oligarch initially appears calm. But one question about why he was there sends the oligarch spiraling. Why don't you ask how the corporate raid on Ukr happened, and how Russians infiltrated the place? Or you just want to fucking see Kolomoisky, the oligarch spits, referring to himself in the third person. We liberated the Ukr building from Russian saboteurs, and you and your colleagues sit here and fucking guard it, like some bimbo with her cheating husband. The journalist who asked the question stood in stunned silence, while Kolomoisky continued taunting him. Why aren't you saying anything? Do you have any questions? Or did your tongue get lost in your ass? It was a bizarre, addled sight. Ukraine's revolution just a year prior was supposed to have made these moments a thing of the past. Yet here Kolomoisky was, an oligarch resurgent, steering the country's banking and metal and gas sectors, spitting venom at reporters, sicking his masked marauders on those who opposed him. One Ukrainian journalist told me Kolomoisky has a psychopathic personality. I think Kolomoisky is super dangerous, an American official, then working in the embassy in Kiev, said. He is probably one of the most dangerous oligarchs because he's one of the ones who's willing to get his hands dirty. He was one of the first oligarchs who began to act like a warlord. Back in the U.S., while Kolomoisky continued building his empire across the Midwest and Rust Belt, folks in Washington continued building on their momentum after toppling Teodorin. Levin and his staff found a new rapport with the new administration in the White House. Buoyed by the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, the U.S., under Obama, showed signs of reorienting resources toward fighting and regulating the kinds of kleptocratic tools that help the crooked regimes hollow out and destabilize countries like Ukraine. A decade after Levin arm-twisted the U.S. banking sector into complying with basic anti-money laundering checks, the wind was suddenly in anti-corruption activist sails. Yet as we'll see through the rest of this chapter, for each step forward in the fight against dirty money and the offshoring world, there was another clear and unexpected step back. First, the victories. In late 2007, A middle-aged, ginger-haired American named Bradley Birkenfeld approached Levin's staff with a bombshell revelation. He disclosed that he had worked for a number of years at the flagship Swiss bank UBS, and what he saw shocked him. According to Birkenfeld, the Swiss reputation for banking secrecy was well earned and wasn't viewed as being nearly as nefarious or disgusting as it should be. Birkenfeld unspooled a raft regarding details of UBS's operations that made Levin's staff furious. The former banker told them that UBS specifically targeted high-net-worth American individuals looking to limit their tax payments, keen to take full advantage of Swiss secrecy laws in order to starve Washington of revenue. A formidable force of Swiss employees traveled to the U.S. multiple times per year to target U.S. clients and convince them to hide money abroad. They would go to Miami art shows, or to yachting events, or to golf and tennis tournaments, and whisper about all the services the Swiss could provide for them. Birkenfeld, part of UBS's U.S. operations, participated in these schemes, actively advising American clients about a range of tactics to hide their money from the government, destroy all offshore banking records existing in the United States, use Swiss bank credit cards that they claimed could not be discovered by U.S. authorities, and file false U.S. individual income tax returns. One UBS banker even memorably helped a client move money by smuggling diamonds in a tube of toothpaste. The revelations made Levin's team blanch. But UBS was hardly the lone Swiss bank advising wealthy Americans on how to shortchange the U.S. government. Later investigations revealed that Credit Suisse, another Swiss banking behemoth, went to even greater lengths in its subterfuge, with bankers there actively promising to shred any compromising documents, and even slipping clients confidential banking information hidden between the pages of Sports Illustrated. And wealthy Americans were only too happy to participate. Later filings revealed that Swiss banks maintained over 50,000 secret American accounts, part of the $20 billion in Swiss accounts linked to U.S. clients, billions of dollars untaxed, hidden by Americans exploiting Swiss secrecy. The reaction to Birkenfeld's revelations was swift. 1 month into the new Obama administration, Washington slapped a $780 million penalty against UBS, forcing the formidable Swiss bank to admit that it conspired to defraud the U.S. The move was an earthquake in the offshore world, Elise Bean later wrote. Expressions of shock reverberated around the globe at the first cracks in Swiss secrecy. It was a huge U.S. victory of the world's biggest tax haven bank. Not long after, the administration one-upped itself, forcing Credit Suisse to pay a staggering $2.6 billion in penalties. In short order, the U.S. had cracked open Switzerland's decades-old secret banking sector, upending Switzerland's offshoring industries, sending its suspect money and all of its enablers scrambling. This was the first real nail in the coffin for Swiss banking secrecy in particular, and offshore secrecy in general. Peter Coderchenu, an expert in Swiss financing, wrote afterward, "In light of the UBS scandal, the United States became the flag-bearer for greater transparency." Nor was that all. In 2010, just a year after pummeling UBS and the entire facade of Swiss secrecy, Congress passed a piece of legislation to follow the administration's lead. Dubbed the Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act, FATCA, the new legislation required all foreign banks to report American holdings to the IRS. In order to coax them to obey, the U.S. threatened a 30% withholding tax on non-compliant banks, as well as a pledge to share information with foreign governments about any foreign nationals who may be using American banks to skirt taxes back home. It was a simple enough model, and one other countries were eager to follow. The most prominent FATCA-inspired program was called the Common Reporting Standard, CRS, a blueprint that required signatory countries to share account information with one another. Launched in 2014, the CRS quickly roped in 100 different countries, becoming, in effect, one giant pool of account-sharing information. All of it thanks to Washington. Thanks to a program that, as The Economist wrote, ushered in a global revolution in financial transparency. But even while the administration was applauding itself for the blows to global offshoring and tax dodging, a parallel force gurgled to the fore, threatening to undo much of the progress Washington had already made. South Dakota, a state in the upper Midwest, is a bit like Delaware. Resource poor, often overlooked, the state is something of an afterthought in the U.S., and it's been that way for decades. From the outside, aside from Mount Rushmore, there's little reason to think about South Dakota. But in the 1980s, the state produced a figure who would upend the world of financial secrecy, and who would help transform South Dakota into the newest American bastion of kleptocracy. William Janklow, Wild Bill as others dubbed him, was as much a bon vivant as he was a visionary. The wide-set Janklow was, as The Guardian described him, a bottomless store of anecdotes about how he once brought a rifle to the scene of a hostage crisis, how his car got blown off the road when he was rushing to the scene of a tornado. As a 16-year governor in the state, Janklow swaggered as a titan of prairie politics, perfecting the art of arm-twisting in the tiny state capital, Pierre. Which is why, when South Dakota saw its economy crater in the early 1980s, the entire state turned its eyes to him. The state didn't have the infrastructure to attract new manufacturing plants. Tourism could only bring so many jobs. And given South Dakota's landlocked status, it's not like the state could transform into a new trade hub or become an import-export bastion. Janklow, though, had a plan that those politicians decades prior in Delaware, a state similarly cursed with few economic opportunities, would have recognized. In 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in a little-noticed decision that American banks would no longer have to be limited by low caps on interest rates, which had been kept to a minimum by anti-usury laws stretching back decades, preventing banks and credit companies from charging inordinately high interest rates. The ruling happened to coincide with banks increasingly dipping their toes into something called credit cards, which allowed consumers to borrow on credit, so long as they were willing to pay the interest rate charged. With those two developments, Janklow stumbled across an idea. Putting out feelers to the banks in New York, Janklow had a question. What would happen if he got South Dakota to abolish all of these nuisance anti-usury regulations? What if he got the state to allow these banks to issue whatever interest rates they'd like? The banks were all ears. Citibank, in particular, told Janklow that it could provide hundreds of jobs if the governor repealed the interest limits. They weren't sure that any state would let them come in, because no state had let any bank come in from the time they passed those laws 50 years earlier, Janklow later said. To me, this wasn't a credit card deal. It was a jobs deal. It was an economic opportunity for the state. Janklow and Citibank swiftly came to an arrangement. In 1981, Janklow oversaw the repeal of South Dakota's previous interest rate limit, and the repeal was an immediate hit with banks and consumers alike. Interest rates suddenly exploded, as did the concomitant consumer debt that resulted from the higher interest rates. It's unbelievable, the lack of sophistication that we have as a society to deal with what I'll call consumer credit, Janklow later said. It really is unbelievable. Do I think I helped foster some of that? The answer is yes, I do. Not that South Dakota minded. To some, South Dakota is a flyover state, one of the state's Supreme Court justices would later say. While many people may find a way to fly over South Dakota, somehow their dollars find a way to land here. But Janklow wasn't done. If it was easy enough to repeal those interest rate ceilings, were there other limits worth repealing? The governor had something in mind. Trusts. Trusts had a far longer legacy than credit cards, or South Dakota, or even the U.S. itself. First developed in the Middle Ages, trusts were simple constructs. A person, the settler, would hand over legal control of finances and assets to another person, the trustee, who was then charged with managing and distributing the finances and assets for future recipients, the beneficiaries. For instance, a father, the settler, would sign over the legal ownership of his estate to a friend, the trustee, who would at an undefined future date relinquish that legal ownership to the father's grandchildren, the beneficiaries. That's it. Simple. Deceptively so, especially since trusts generally remain secretive, unavailable for public scrutiny. Trusts are powerful mechanisms, journalist Nicholas Shaxson once wrote, usually with no evidence of their existence on public record anywhere. That's how trusts operated for centuries, through the Enlightenment, through the Great Wars, through the ascent of America on the global stage. By the early 1980s, trusts stood broadly similar to their medieval precedents. And then Janklow showed up, and trusts turned into something else entirely. Shortly after Janklow torpedoed interest rate caps, he hit on a new idea. What if South Dakota removed the cap on the chronology of trusts? Trusts generally expired after a century, or a few decades after the death of the settler, forcing the distribution of any remaining assets. Anything else would have been ludicrous. And yet, that's precisely what Janklow wanted. In 1983, the South Dakota legislature repealed the rule against perpetuities, the regulation that limited the duration of these secretive trusts. In their wake, South Dakota introduced a new tool to the world, perpetual trusts, sometimes called dynasty trusts. These new perpetual trusts, according to the South Dakota legislature, have no end. They can last as long as you want. They can last until South Dakota slips into the sea or until the sun burns from the sky. They can outlast us all, and do so in perfect secrecy. Those dynasty trusts, of course, needed lawyers. They needed accountants. They needed managers. They needed white-collar South Dakotans to oversee them and their operations. As with the interest rate repeal, this new perpetual trust industry created thousands more jobs in South Dakota, offering services to anyone who wanted to bundle their finances into a trust and keep it secret in perpetuity. Even though these perpetual trusts initially met with much derision, Janklow didn't exist in a vacuum. Other state governments watched South Dakota's regulatory rollback and tried to get their own piece of the deregulated pie. Following South Dakota's lead, a number of other states by the end of the 20th century had introduced their own perpetual trust industries. Janklow, though, wouldn't let South Dakota's advantage slip. In 1997, with billions starting to flock to the state to take advantage of the secretive perpetual trust industry, Janklow formed a trust task force. Comprising legislators and leading figures in the trust industry, the task force proposed tweaks and reforms that made it seem like the trust industry was writing laws essentially for themselves, said one state legislator. Or as Tom Simmons, an expert on trust law at the University of South Dakota and member of the task force, told me, it's kind of like sports, you know. You have to keep a few points ahead of the other people. And what reforms they were. In South Dakota, not only do trusts remain entirely secret from the public, or from journalists, or tax authorities, or human rights activists trying to track down looted assets, but any court documents pertaining to South Dakota trusts are kept private in perpetuity. No information on South Dakota trusts will ever be shared with other governments, and those looking to hide their funds don't need to move to South Dakota to take advantage of the trusts, or even use any local banks. One trust specialist in the state estimated that nearly all trusts in the state are what I call shell companies, where you basically have a P.O. box or an office, and somebody will come here twice a year to have board meetings and meet regulatory requirements, but there's nobody here with feet on the ground. And now, those hiding their money in South Dakota no longer even need beneficiaries like children or grandchildren. Instead, people can set up South Dakota trusts with themselves as the listed beneficiaries, using the anonymous perpetual trust industry's secrecy as a shield, keeping their finances hidden from any prying eyes. To be sure, there are plenty of perfectly legitimate reasons to set up and maintain trusts. Some are aimed at helping spendthrift descendants limit their expenditures. Some are meant to be spent only on education, or to finance the lives of children suffering from disabilities after the parents have died. But what South Dakota introduced was something qualitatively different, something meant to explicitly create new dynasties, which would never have to participate in silly things like taxation or financial transparency. What South Dakota guaranteed was anonymity from everyone, forever. South Dakota offers the best privacy and asset protection laws in the country, and possibly in the world, for the wealthy to protect their assets, one financial advisor told The Guardian, with another observer saying that South Dakota legislators had turned the Mount Rushmore state into the Bermuda of the Prairie. Or as one South Dakota journalist wrote in 2016, forget Switzerland. South Dakota is actually one of the best places in the world for the wealthy to stash their cash in secret. Of course, those profiting from South Dakota's sprint to becoming an offshore haven of its own don't see things this way. We're certainly always worried about the black eye of one nefarious actor one money laundering or white-collar crime that somehow utilized our trust industry to commit wrongful acts, Simmons, the member of the state's trust task force, claimed. It's not the Wild West, but rather one of the more regulated industries in our country. But then the Wild West technically had laws and regulations on its books too. Not that they stopped the railroad barons and white supremacists from bending the laws to their own wills, devastating communities along the way. Which is precisely what South Dakota's trust industry has begun doing, on a global scale. Starting in the early 2010s, hundreds of billions of dollars in untraceable money began stampeding to the state, with estimates now placing the total worth in these anonymous, unregulated South Dakota trusts at nearly $1 trillion. Ironically enough, much of it rushed in from Switzerland. None are subject to any anti-money laundering requirements, or to oversight of any kind, and none are required to ever return any assets to the populations from which they were looted. The voters in South Dakota don't have a clue what this means. Susan Wismer, a local Democratic official, said, "They've never seen a feudal society. They don't have a clue what they're enabling." We've only just gotten a peek behind South Dakota's offshore curtain in recent years, though not because of South Dakota itself. Instead, it's been filings elsewhere that have revealed some of the details of South Dakota's supernova explosion into the world's newest offshore haven. Over the past few years, a number of corporate filings in, of all places, China, revealed that a range of Chinese oligarchs have begun smuggling their money into South Dakota. Tens of billions of dollars in suspect Chinese monies have flowed to the state, including billions tied to Chinese real estate developers and billions more tied directly to one of China's wealthiest women. That is, the oligarchs and kleptocrats who've grown wealthy from their ties to the ruling dictatorship in Beijing have effectively partnered with officials in South Dakota to hide their money, to partake in this prairie-based version of American kleptocracy. Back in Miami, Kolomoisky's American helpers wanted to reward themselves for all their hard work in allegedly helping stash the Ukrainian oligarchs' funds across the U.S. Mordecai Korf, a man whose father had slaughtered chickens himself and who had raised Korf and his siblings on a shoestring budget, bought for himself a 9-bedroom, 8-bathroom mansion in a posh Miami Beach enclave called Sunset Lake, its walls and columns bleached white, a pool shimmering in the back. The tab, $7.7 million. His compatriot, Uri Leiber, moved a few blocks down, snapping up a similar mansion for $14 million. Korf also looked elsewhere to display his new wealth. In 2008, a new foundation received tax-exempt status, the Korf Family Foundation. Overseen by Korf, it's unclear what the mission or even the registered location of the Korf Family Foundation is. However, the foundation, along with the Labor Foundation, set up by Labor, nonetheless became another prong to move significant sums, funneling tens of millions of dollars toward Jewish nonprofits from 2006 to 2018. It's the whole concept of wealthy Jews helping the community, Labor claimed at one point. Let's build something nice. And people noticed. As Forward wrote, Korf and Labor, through their donations, through their status, had come to represent the pinnacle of generosity to many religious Jews in Florida. Of course, no one knew exactly where Korf's money came from, nor was anyone quite sure of his connections to Kolomoisky. "I think Kolomoisky is a shareholder," Korf at one point claimed to an inquiring reporter, downplaying a years-long relationship. To those on the outside, it all remained a mystery. But no one, not in Cleveland, not in those small Rust Belt steel towns, not in those nonprofits receiving new millions from Korf himself, wanted to look too far anyway. Chapter 12. A Gaping Hole. If I ever saw myself saying I'm excited going to Cleveland, I'd punch myself in the face, because I'm lying. Ichiro Suzuki. In the aftermath of Ukraine's 2014 revolution, a new raft of reformers entered power in Kiev. Investigative journalists joined parliament, spearheading anti-corruption inquiries with the levers of state finally in their hands. A new range of pro-transparency bodies burst forth, including the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, tasked specifically with tackling elite-level graft. and the country's banking sector welcomed a new head dedicated to cleaning up networks that had spent years hollowing out Ukraine's financial structures. In the summer of 2014, the government named Valeria Gontareva the new head of the National Bank of Ukraine, NBU, the first woman appointed to steer the country's banking governing body. Gontareva immediately got to work, cutting bloat, targeting insolvent banks, and earning plaudits from international financiers long wary of the murk and muck surrounding Ukraine's financial sector. Along the way, though, Gontareva and her colleagues realized there was one primary bank more important to tackle than all the others. Privatbank had exploded by the mid-2010s into Ukraine's largest banking conglomerate, luring depositors by offering notably higher interest rates than its competitors. The bank, as BNE Intellinews wrote, was present on every high street across Ukraine, with its branches outnumbering those of the state-owned savings bank. Housing one-third of the country's retail deposits, with small-scale Ukrainian depositors entrusting the bank with billions of dollars, Privatbank was identified by authorities in Kyiv as the only private bank of systemic importance to the country. But Gontareva had her suspicions. In Ukraine, it's all oligarchic banking, she told me, glint-eyed under her blonde bob. These banking licenses are used just for money laundering. And the head of Privatbank was hardly some gadfly. Kolomoisky was a well-known quantity in post-revolution Kyiv and across Ukraine. As such, when it came to Privatbank, Gontareva sensed something others around her had grown to suspect: money laundering, on a massive scale. "I've been working in this field for 30 years, and could understand that something was wrong," she said. So she began probing the bank's books, and it didn't take long for her to confirm her suspicions. When it came to Ukrainian banks transforming into money laundering machines, Privatbank wasn't an exception, Gontareva told me. The problem was that it was the biggest one. Soon, Gontareva and her colleagues made a shocking discovery. Rather than the sturdy bastion of the country's private banking industry that Privatbank claimed to be, it was instead a vacant, cobwebbed cabinet, and billions in deposits were, somehow, missing. In public, the bank presented itself as a staple of financial stability for a country teetering from revolution and invasion. But internal documents told a different story. Privatbank's loan book was pockmarked with all kinds of offshore entities, all kinds of obscure shells, what the Ukrainian authorities described as fraud loans. As one analysis detailed, hardly any other borrower on the loan book is a recognizable corporate brand, easily identifiable with a real business. The recipients, it appeared, were little more than ghosts. As another analysis described, 99% of the loans on the bank's books were fake. Gontareva and her allies immediately scrambled. Suddenly, Ukrainian authorities and the bank's depositors were staring into the crumbling hole Privatbank had left behind. The new authorities found only one solution: nationalizing the bank, rescuing it by rerouting billions of dollars in Ukrainian taxpayer monies in order to cover the missing deposits. They would take care of the missing money now, in the hopes of finding the missing money later. The government swiftly patched a $5.5 billion hole in the bank's finances, if only to save the country's entire banking sector from going belly up. Either Privatbank was going down, and the whole banking system would die with it, or the government had to save it, one Ukrainian journalist who's covered Kolomoisky told me. Or, as Daria Kalinyuk, the noted anti-corruption activist, added, Kolomoisky managed to create a bank that was too big to fail. Instead of acting as a pillar of a new Ukraine, Privatbank had punched a mile-wide hole into the bleeding Ukrainian budget. And as Gontareva soon discovered, instead of acting as a dependable partner of Ukrainians across the country, those behind Privatbank had launched the greatest Ponzi scheme the country had ever seen. No one imagined it was like this, Gontareva told me. It was all a Ponzi scheme. There were no assets at all. That's why I called this the biggest fraud of the 21st century. After nationalizing Privatbank, authorities in Kyiv had one question: where had all the money gone? As investigators and forensic accountants later discovered, the Privatbank Ponzi scheme stood, as with many Ponzi schemes, both confusingly complex and perfectly straightforward. The key to Privatbank's Ponzi success was what some dubbed a shadow bank, or a bank within the bank. Here's how the scheme worked, according to both Ukrainian and American authorities. After Privatbank processed the latest round of deposits from unsuspecting Ukrainians, an internal credit committee made up of Kolomoisky's lackeys would meet to discuss what to do with the latest intake. Rather than an independent roster of accountants and financial experts shepherding the bank's best interests, this internal credit committee had one job: turn that money into loans for a wide array of shell companies connected to Kolomoisky, as well as to his oligarchic partner, Gennady Bugoyabov, whom we met in Chapter 4. It didn't matter whether the loans made sense, or if anyone had any reservations. All that mattered was their signature, and that, as a later DOJ filing detailed, they simply hit approve whenever they received a loan application from a company connected to Kolomoisky. Not that the employees on the credit committee had much of a choice. If employees did express dissent, they would lose their bonuses, have work taken away, or simply be fired, the DOJ later said. Those consequences were particularly harsh in context. Privatbank offered the highest-paying jobs in the region. As one employee said, approving those loans was as expected as opening the door and walking into the office. But simply rerouting the loans to Kolomoisky's shell companies would have been a bit too obvious. The oligarch may have been greedy, but he was hardly stupid. Instead of keeping the new loans themselves, his companies would then redirect those loans into separate accounts set up at Privatbank's branch in the Mediterranean nation of Cyprus, which itself is a notorious offshore haven. As one analysis found, these shell companies had billions of dollars moving in and out of their accounts, even though the entities had no business, assets, operations, or employees, and were shell entities deployed for money laundering purposes. Instead, they effectively existed only to steal from the Ukrainian depositors who'd trusted Privatbank, said the DOJ. But those Cyprus bank accounts weren't the final step. That Cypriot branch then chopped and bundled the loans themselves, partitioning them among a number of accounts, mixing and mingling and swishing and swirling the incoming money so that, by the time the Cypriot bank was done, there was no telling which monies could be tied to which specific loan. It was as if the money had been atomized, deconstructed, and then built back into something completely different, something completely untraceable, which the oligarch could then use as he saw fit. Up to this point, the methods were relatively straightforward. A dirty bank bundling loans to insiders, bouncing them among shell companies, obscuring their sourcing. This had been done, time and again, in Mexico and Equatorial Guinea and anywhere oligarchs controlled the levers of financial institutions. But Privatbank and Kolomoisky had a pair of innovations that made them stand apart. First, there was the amount of time involved. With a bit of focus, offshoring can be a relatively swift process. Some phone calls, some documents signed, some clicks confirming the transfers, and clean money can emerge in the millions in a matter of weeks, or even days if you're lucky. Privatbank, though, took that speed to another level. It's as if the looted funds were all piled into a blender, a switch was flipped, and voila! A few minutes later, millions in dirty money had been pureed clean, perfectly available for consumption, indistinguishable from whatever it had been prior. Where previous offshoring schemes took weeks, Kolomoisky's allegedly took minutes. In just one example, later highlighted by American officials, a loan was deposited and then withdrawn from the accounts of 13 different shell entities in a total of 17 transactions at Privatbank's Cyprus branch, all in only 8 minutes. In less time than it takes to bake some cookies, or to watch an inning of baseball, the new mixed, mingled, swished, swirled money emerged, clean and untraceable. It's still unclear exactly how Kolomoisky's system achieved this level of laundering speed and creativity, although suspicions center on some kind of machine learning or artificial intelligence software that figured out how to best mix and match the funds. Criminals use technology more efficiently than healthcare professionals, Gontareva told me. Second, and perhaps more important, the next steps didn't necessarily see Kolomoisky and his cronies park the pureed, clean money in Manhattan high-rises or Malibu beachfronts or Miami condos, the kind of places that Teodorin and so many others had previously turned to in order to transform their dirty money into legitimate assets. Instead, there was something that Ukrainian and American investigators dubbed loan recycling. The idea behind this, as with the rest of the entire operation, was simple. Kolomoisky's aides would take the mixed, mingled, swished, swirled money from the Cypriot accounts, bundle it, and bounce it through a few more banks and a few more accounts across Europe, and then use it to purchase legitimate assets elsewhere. Maybe those assets were commercial buildings in a city like Cleveland. Maybe they were in a steel town like Warren, Ohio. Maybe they were in a factory town like Harvard, Illinois. The details didn't necessarily matter. All that mattered was that the money was then used to pick up physical property, plants and factories and commercial constructs elsewhere. On paper, the money was still listed as a loan, one that needed to be paid back at some point. However, Kolomoisky and his helpers had a different idea. Instead of using those new physical assets to pay back the initial loans, Privatbank would simply issue new loans to cover up the initial loans. The basic idea was simple, a later DOJ filing detailed. Kolomoisky requested money from Privatbank, which he always received and rarely paid it back, except through new loans. Privatbank was simply recycling the loans and increasing its losses. Everything on paper looked fine. The old loans looked like they'd been taken care of. But while certain loans were paid when they came due, in reality, they were being paid through the issuance of additional debt. No new money came in to cover those initial loans, only that which had been swiped from the unsuspecting Ukrainian depositors who kept funneling their savings into the bank. All of which meant that Kolomoisky effectively used Privatbank as his personal piggy bank, never expecting to have to pay the money back. It was an ever-expanding cycle. New Privatbank loans begat new shell company transfers, which begat new asset purchases, which begat new debts, which begat new loans, which begat new transfers, which begat new purchases, which begat new debts, which begat new loans. On and on and on. All while trusting Ukrainian consumers turned to Privatbank with their deposits. On paper, all the documentation appeared above board. Old loans appeared to be repaid, and new loans appeared to have perfectly legitimate purposes, listed for things like investments or retail. But the whole thing was, said American officials, a series of slush funds. As Gontareva said upon discovering the entire process, it appeared to be a scam of momentous proportions. In time, investigators would discover that Kolomoisky and his team had potentially laundered nearly $500 billion with this playbook. If this is true, said Anders Östlund, an expert on post-Soviet corruption at the Atlantic Council, this is the biggest case of money laundering in history, and it has been perpetrated by one single group. But as Ukrainian and American authorities discovered, Kolomoisky didn't construct this loan recycling cum Ponzi scheme with just intimidated accountants and unwitting depositors. He also happened to have a group of helpers in the U.S., a group the DOJ would refer to as the Optima family. By the mid-2010s, Korf and Shokit and the entire Optima network stood atop a sprawling kingdom of commercial real estate, steel towns, and factory plants that cut a swath through the Midwest and Rust Belt. And the Americans had plenty to show for it. Not only was Shokit faded across Cleveland, but Korf and his partner Labor relaxed in Greco-Spanish mansions in Miami, dispensing millions in new money to charities and compatriots. As American officials later laid out, many of the millions suddenly lining Korf's and Labor's pockets clearly stemmed from Optima-related schemes, including one $13 million transfer from Optima International directly to Korf, Labor, and their families. And the group's profile in South Florida only kept rising. As the DOJ noted, as Korf and Labor's resources expanded, they moved the Optima headquarters in Miami from the 30th floor to the 36th, and finally the 55th floor, the penthouse. It's unclear when exactly they realized the